can hear on the webcast.
And then Louise said. Do you remember the hot mic thing in the legislature? That time we had a meeting in the committee?
Okay, good afternoon. I feel like this is the Great Wall of EPA here. This is new. This is why we've been meeting in other locations. Yes, so they could build the wall. Okay, well, the audience is now really far away, but it's nice to see you here. Welcome to the Strategic Growth Council meeting for November. We have a fair amount on the agenda. So why don't we start with a little roll call. Jenna, why don't we start with you? Just say you're here and who you represent.
Jana Olson Morgan with
Jana,
California Health and
Jana.
Human Services Agency.
Marlon Flournoy with the California Transportation Agency, representing Secretary Annis.
Deborah Hoffman with the Business Consumer Services and Housing Agency, representing Secretary Podesta.
Bob Fisher, public member.
Ken Alex, Office of Planning and Research.
John Laird, Resources Secretary, clearly representing only himself.
Karen Ross,
Department of Food and Agriculture.
Michael Flad, public member.
Okay. Just a reminder, and I see Secretary Rodriguez making his way as well, so he'll be here. We have a full house. And just a reminder, if you want to comment on any of the items or do a general public comment, please fill out a card and bring it up to our folks at the front. Thank you. All right. First on the agenda is the approval of the minutes from the last meeting. Do I hear a motion to approve the minutes? A second?
Second.
We have a motion and a second. All. Thank you. You don't want to discuss it for a while? All those in favor of approving the minutes, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Passes unanimously. Moving on to council member updates. Anybody have an update? Secretary Laird?
I thought it's very hard, given the current circumstances, to not at least report or acknowledge the fires of the last few weeks. And as I was just saying in private conversations with a couple of people, I spent yesterday with Secretaries Perdue and Zinke in Paradise and was up there earlier with the governor. And I think within the realm of the Strategic Growth Council, there are many issues that will present themselves in the decisions that may or may not get made to rebuild Paradise and to deal with it. And I think as somebody that's a former mayor, and I know there's other people with municipal experience here, it's just so hard to get my arms around the fact that an entire city went. That yes, there's a few buildings that are still there. And the mayor yesterday, and the mayor and the city council members all lost their homes. They had a meeting last week in Chico. They have essentially no revenue. The police force is still operating. It's just a disaster that's hard to describe. But for example, Paradise was the largest city in the state to be on septic and not have a sewer system. So in deciding how to rebuild, they will probably be dealing with that issue. They after a threat of a fire 10 years ago, constructed a second way in and out. And obviously, with a fire that was described to us by the people there as advancing 60 acres a minute as it came through Paradise, those two exits were not adequate. So how do you deal with the transportation flow? There were actually some interesting firefighting things that I couldn't have imagined without being there, because CAL FIRE always has the ethic that when the evacuation order is necessary, everybody moves out. And the fire moves so much faster than those sequences that there's this one Rite Aid that is right in the middle of town that they pulled every fire engine that was near there, and there were between 100 and 200 people that were escorted in that could not move out, and they defended that building as the fire burned over it, making sort of the decision that that's how they would respond. And so I could keep going, but almost every issue was a Strategic Growth Council issue about how you develop, how you grow, where you place certain municipal services, how you organize a city. And I think this is going to be, just as it's true with Coffee Park, just as it's true with the neighborhood in Reading, and maybe to some extent in the Malibu area, there are going to be big decisions about how to rebuild, and if to rebuild, or how to rebuild more resilient. And I think we sort of have dealt with the issues of growth on a green basis, and our resilience has probably been defined different than the resilience. I mean, it was interesting because Ken Pimlott and I worked together on the whole thing yesterday, and he was driving, and we would go by buildings, and I would say, well, that's interesting. There's a storage facility, and it completely survived. And he says, look at it. It's got a wall around it. It's stucco. The building is stucco. It's metal. There's no places for the fire to get in because it's sealed. That was probably a resilient way to build that building and that complex, although I don't know if people were considering that at the time that they sort of planned it and constructed it. So I just think for those of you that are carrying forward, as the administration changes, there might be some opportunities to involve yourself with some of the principles of the Growth Council in how some of these issues are faced going forward. And I think some of the issues that are going to arise still aren't clear because we're still at the search and recovery stage up there. But as somebody that's a former mayor, it was just hard for me to grasp the revenue issue, the service issues, the rebuilding issues. And as I was telling somebody else, the other odd thing is as this has progressed, I've realized how many people I knew in Paradise that I don't think I even knew lived in Paradise. I have 5 people I went to high school with, 1 in college, 1 coworker from years ago, other people that work for CAL FIRE. There are over 100 resources agency employees that lost their house in the fire there. And I know from knowing them personally what their economic situation is. And it's not necessarily an economic situation. It gives them a lot of alternatives in how to deal when what's reconstructed or comes back, and that's going to factor into what's possible. But I would just suggest that the staff just be aware of how the things that we deal with are going to come up there and just integrate ourselves in ways that it's appropriate.
Okay, other.
Well, let me just
Bob.
make one follow-on comment to that. Does it make sense for the staff to take a look at the work that we do, and between now and our next meeting, maybe report back to the council on how we can use our work, our funding, and sort of put a layer of fire over that to sort of understand the impacts of fire on the work we do, whether fire ought to be woven into some of the guidelines of things that we're already funding. I just don't. I can't really think about. I don't know, but I wonder whether we can ask staff to do that between now and when we meet next, or maybe that's too large a task.
No, I might have a
tackle.
helpful suggestion, and that is that in this, there are certain maps or just zoning, not in the municipal zoning way, of highest fire danger throughout the state, and the staff might just do an inquiry to CAL FIRE at the staff level, because yesterday in one of the meetings, the chief was just describing the highest risk areas, and he sort of went down the entire Highway 49 corridor, certain hilly areas in the Bay Area and other areas where there have been fires, and it's obvious, certain hilly areas in Southern California. And the thing might be to sort of examine where there are high-risk areas and whether they cross over or interact with areas that we traditionally fund.
So a couple of points here. First, you may recall last year with the fires in Sonoma that the Strategic Growth Council did give the direction, and the staff, I'm sure, followed, to look and see if there are funding opportunities there. So I'm sure that the council and staff will continue to do that. That's number one. Number two, as all of you know, there's a whole series of pieces of legislation around fire, directing agencies to do quite a number of things, including OPR, which is supposed to have a catastrophic fire commission, and then a whole series of things in resources agency, et cetera. And so I want to be a little bit careful that we don't have the SGC, which crosses all of these things, recreating any of these things or even getting in the way of them. So I don't think anything that Bob or John just suggested would do that, but just, let's be a little bit careful and not, because it is a crisis still, we don't want to get in the way of some of the things that are coming down the pike. Okay. Any other? Matt?
I just wanted to note that yesterday the Air Resources Board released the 2018 progress report which it's required to do on every 4 years, do a report on our progress in implementing basically SB 375 and the Sustainable Communities and Climate Protection Act. And not surprisingly, it noted that while we're meeting our overall target for 2020 and reducing greenhouse gas emissions below 1990 levels, we have a lot to work to do with regional planning, in particular, reducing emissions related to the transportation sector. So, it's a comprehensive report, and I didn't know whether Louise might get into it. My understanding is that she had worked somewhat with ARB in preparing this report. But my suggestion would be that at a future meeting of the SGC, ARB come in and talk a little bit about the report, their findings here, and how it relates to the work that we do at the SGC and how it fits in with our grant programs. So I just want to know the report is out. It's worth taking a look at clearly, and just a suggestion that we or a Strategic Growth Council look at it at some time in the future and talk about the findings and how they fit with our work.
I appreciate that, and I will also note that the ARB staff integrated OPR's comments nicely as well, which was much appreciated. Okay, I have one request for public comment, and if I want to defer it until after the executive director's report. That's Harvey, looks like Eder or Edger. So if you don't mind, we'll wait until after the executive director's report and have you come up then. So Louise, you're on.
Great. Well, thank you all. Good afternoon. I'm going to be very brief because we're going to dedicate most of the executive director's report time to getting an informational update on Assembly Bill 2800, which is, and the report that came out of that work led by the Natural Resources Agency. I think we had flagged it at a previous meeting that report had been released, and one of the stipulations of the legislation is to present it to the Strategic Growth Council. So we will dedicate most of this time to that report, but I will provide a few brief updates. We also have two other informational updates on the agenda, so I won't provide too much information there. So quickly, I just want to provide a quick staffing update. SGC was very lucky yesterday to have 2 new executive fellows placed at the Strategic Growth Council, one working generally on SGC issues, Alex Gallo, and then Shelby McMichael is actually going to be staffed to support the health and all policies work at SGC. A couple updates since our last meeting on the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities program. I just wanted to mention that we've held 6 application workshops throughout the state. And then on the 2 requests that came up at the council meeting, we are reviewing scoring threshold, both our current threshold and what that looks like, the threshold analysis we do for all applications, and then looking at our previous rounds of awards and applications to be able to come back to the council on that issue. And we are beginning outreach to the MPOs. To Secretary Rodriguez's point regarding the progress report, we did not have time to integrate it into today's agenda. We did discuss that several times with ARB as they were preparing that work. I think it really dovetails with this topic of how we work with the MPOs on the implementation of our programs, AHSC and otherwise, and how we can really align and use our programs to best support meeting their goals and reducing vehicle miles traveled. And so we're continuing to work on that, and I think that report provides even more impetus for doing so. I'll also mention on the fire issue, we do have requirements and we do have an adaptation and resilience element to all of our programs. Specifically on the fire recovery piece, SGC and OPR are plugged in with Cal OES and all of the multi-agency and department structure on recovery support functions, which is part of the state's recovery plan. And I think right now several of us have been on phone calls we're still really in an acute response mode, and so I think we're really trying to figure out how we can support, and we see our role primarily in that long-term recovery piece, but staying part of that dialogue as it moves forward, particularly in this community development recovery support function. So we'll keep folks apprised of that. And certainly, as we did following the Sonoma fires, if there are ways we can plug in directly to help, we absolutely will do so, and have indicated that to the state leads on those programs. So 2 other quick updates, just knowing we will be here in less than a month again on 2 other programs. I just wanted to give you all a quick snapshot of where we are with the Climate Change Research Program and Transformative Climate Communities. We had our application deadline for the second round of the research program on November 9th. We received 24 applications. Once again, we're about oversubscribed. We have $18 million available by between 6 and 7 times the requested than we have available. So once again, very popular program. Really great distribution of applications across the research areas from a variety of institutions, UC, CSU, private universities, and nonprofits and national labs. Technical review and interagency review is underway over this week and next, so a lot of work happening there. On transformative climate communities, we had the application deadline the day after our last meeting. We received 4 implementation award applications and 7 planning grant applications. Site visits are underway to the implementation grant applicants this week, so including 1 today, and then 2 later this week and 1 yesterday, and then the review is underway, and that committee will be meeting next week. So just wanted to give everybody an update on that, and in both programs we anticipate award recommendations coming to the council in December. And so with that, I'm going to, as I said, we'll dedicate the rest of this time to a quick informational update on Assembly Bill 2800. This is the Climate Safe Infrastructure Working Group, and it was through legislation authored by Assemblymember Quirk, directed the Natural Resources Agency to convene a working group with a real focus on engineers, on how to develop standards and pathways forward for climate safe infrastructure. Very timely given the earlier conversation. So this report prepared several recommendations and has been presented to the legislature, as I understand this morning, and then to the SGC this afternoon. So Secretary Laird, I don't know if you'd like to say anything, or I can hand it off to the report, the leads of that report work.
Before we do that, I just want to see if the council has any questions on the other topics that you just went through. Okay, I just wanted to thank you and the staff, because I know getting everything ready before the end of the year is no small task, and it's very much appreciated by the council. So, John, with that, over to you.
Well, no, I think I'll have some comments, but I think I'd like to do them after the presentation is made, so the presentation could tee up the comments.
Great.
Just one question. Is 4 applications for the transformative climate communities, that seems light. Is that, were you surprised at that number, or is that the number, are those the communities you were working with, or can you give me some context for that?
Let me remember that on the transformative climate communities, which is the significant chunk of money, these are very substantial applications. And so the planning grant process seems to then lead to a serious TCC process. I think we probably think this is about the right number of applications for people to review, and the amount of work put into them. So I think, at least from my perspective, I'm sure Louise will weigh in, but from my perspective, this is a pretty nice outcome.
How many, in looking at the monies, how many does it look like we're going to be able to fund?
We have $50 million, and so it'll be the council's decision, but given that the smallest grant last year was $35 million, I would think that no more than 2.
Yeah, I would say, I think, agreed that given the amount of work that goes into preparing the application, our focus on the top 5% of most disadvantaged communities in California and the amount of money we have, I think this is about right, because it is a significant amount of effort on behalf of the applicant and all of their partners, as well as a lot of staff time that goes into the site visit, the review, looking through all the different project types, and really coordinating across a number of agencies and departments. So I think, for this second round, I think it's a good place for us to be. If we can grow the program, we certainly would be capable to. I think, but for this round, I think this is right, a good place to be.
Deborah?
Really quickly, can you tell us the 4 applicants?
Yes, I think I can, right? I'm looking. Oakland, Sacramento, Pacoima, and Riverside. And so 3 of the 4 applied previously. Oakland is a new applicant, and Riverside had a planning grant, as I understand.
Thank you.
Great. So with that, I'm going to pass it over actually to Juliet Finzi-Hart and Susie Mosier, who led the AB 2800 work. Oh, you found your glasses. Oh, I'm sorry. I should have grabbed them.
No, it's okay. She found my glasses. I dropped them on the street, so we're just having a moment. So thank you so much for this opportunity to speak to you as the council members with SGC. Secretary Laird, you could not have tragically and poignantly sort of provided the context for the work that I'm going to talk about right now. What we've done in the last month through the leadership of the Resources Agency and the work of the working group hopefully will help us as we think through the paradises to come, unfortunately. So I am speaking on behalf of my co-partner on this, which is Dr. Susie Moser, and then most importantly on the working group that was established by AB 2800. So if you're not familiar with the legislation, as Louise mentioned, it was put forth by Assemblymember Quirk and sponsored by the Union of Concerned Scientists. And the goal of this legislation was to basically help the state consider how to incorporate forward-looking climate information in state infrastructure and planning and the entire life cycle of infrastructure, from the planning and the design stage all the way to the implementation, to the maintenance and ongoing just work of maintaining infrastructure, all the way to the end. So ostensibly, it was really focused on the science that drives how the state should go forward in their development. As you'll see as I continue to talk, it grew into something a lot larger than that. The scope of the actual legislation itself, the scope of it is the threefold. One was to assess the informational and institutional barriers to incorporating forward-looking climate information in state design infrastructure, to identify what the critical information needs were of engineers, and then given the uncertainty that surrounds climate science and what we can expect for the future, to try to develop a process to identify and select appropriate engineering designs for different climate scenarios. Within that last one, that looked at how do we integrate the scientific knowledge that we have into on-the-ground actual projects, thinking about where these information gaps and how we can fill those, and then just trying to discern if there's a platform or a process that needs to be established in which we can have more interaction among climate scientists and engineers and architects so that the cross-pollination of the information that both sides have can come together to help inform as the state moves forward. This was we tried to make, sorry, wrong slide. So this is the heart of the legislation. This is the working group that was established. And so it was about 2/3 comprised of state engineers and architects. We had folks from Caltrans, DEGS, Department of Water Resources, and High Speed Rail. We also had a local representative who's here as well, Dr. Chris Lieben from Metro LA, and he was important in showing us how to take what we were just discussing at the state level to bring it to the kind of the on-the-ground implementation. And then we also had about 4 or 5 different scientists that were focused on climate science, social science, economics, and we also had the state architect. So this working group met and deliberated over 6 months to try to tackle the goals of this legislation. Susie and I led the co-facilitation of it, and then it was supported by the Resources Agency, by Kaylee Bright, and Joey Wall and Elia Becker-Lowe, and then also from the California Energy Commission side by Guido Franco. So what we tried to do in developing the process, we had a really tight timeline in which to do this. We basically had 6 months between the implementation of the working group to when we had to deliver the report. And so we tried to make this as transparent and open a process as possible. We held 6 meetings across the state in different locations so that if people were interested from San Diego, for instance, they didn't have to travel all the way to Sacramento, but we wanted to provide those opportunities for people to be there. It was open to the public. And we held them monthly. And then to support the work of these working group meetings, we also established a webinar series. So we held over the course of the 6 months some 17 different webinars where we were able to bring in experts from different topic areas, both to support the work of the working group, and then it also provided a venue for the working group members to go into more detail about some of their work. And all of this information still lives on the website that's housed on the Resources Agency. The webinars are available. The report that was eventually published, all the chapters, all the appendices, all the work products that we developed are available in our resource to all of the agencies that make up the council and to basically the entire state, all the way down to the practitioner level. And we did a really extensive literature review. We have something like 250 different sources that we reviewed for this, and about 90% of those are publicly accessible. So if you have some time and want to dig into the literature, you can just click a button and get to those resources. And then we've been doing a lot of outreach sort of as the process is going and moving forward now. And it's mandated in the legislation that we present to the Strategic Growth Council. But again, given the opening remarks and Louise's update just now, I think it's more than just a mandate. There really is a role for the Strategic Growth Council in this type of work moving forward. So we hope to highlight that here. So, when we first thought of this legislation, it was really focused on the climate science and standards and the guidelines that needed to be put in place to kind of move infrastructure development forward. And what we quickly found in discussing this was that it was much broader than that. That really, that part, well, you won't be able to see if I point, so I won't point. But that part fits into that first top box there of data and analytics. But really, there's a whole system around infrastructure that needs to be considered. There's the project pipeline, there's the ability to have the projects in place that you want to fund, there's the governance structures, both on the governmental side, but also on the guidelines and on all the different components that actually will enable implementation of some of the strategies that we discuss, the financing tools, and ultimately workforce development and making sure that you have staff that can actually implement what you want them to implement. So I'll talk about, we came up with 10 recommendations through this report, and I will talk through those very quickly, and hopefully we'll have some time for questions to dig into the details. So before you can get into the actual implementation of all these 5 steps before, you need to have a vision. And that was the first step of what we presented. And so our first recommendation is really trying to develop this vision for the state about how to achieve true climate-safe infrastructure. So the state has been a lead, of course, as we all know, in our attempts to lower our emissions reduction, or reduce our emissions. And it's taken a very aggressive and ambitious goal to reach the Paris Accord. This has been established by regulation, and the state is moving forward. Now, it's an incremental process. No one was asked to immediately cut emissions the next day, but it's been this process that's been ongoing. What we thought was important to do with the working group was to provide sort of the corollary to that and think about, we'll do our best to reduce our emissions, but California is just one state in a global world. And if it should come to pass that not everybody follows our path, we also need to be prepared for the more high emissions scenario. So what we put forward was the idea that to have a truly safe, climate-safe California, we need to be actively working to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions while also planning and having a path for how to get to the safest possible infrastructure that we can have. This, again, is not meant to say it has to all be built to 10 feet of sea level rise and 4 degrees of warming tomorrow. It's meant to say that we want to have an understanding that that may be where we get. We have a pathway to get there, and we have a plan to get there, and hopefully we won't ever have to get there. But we at least have this path set out to get us on that way. But equally important to that, as we're doing with the greenhouse side, is ensuring that this is done in an equitable manner, where it's not leaving behind those that have been traditionally left behind. So that was the first recommendation, which is that the state should adopt this climate-safe path for all. The next 2 recommendations focus a little bit on the funding and the engagement of scientists and engineers. Adaptation has been a fairly ad hoc process. It's been funded as it can, a lot through the Resources Agency, again, and it needs to be something that has a consistent source of funding. And so this is something where we just heard where the Strategic Growth Council has already shown a lot of leadership in funding a lot of really important work on climate change. But it needs to be a more sort of cohesive approach to funding, making sure that we can have the funding in place to do our quadrennial climate assessments. Equal to that is that I think if you speak to any of the working group members, the thing that they most took away from this whole process was the opportunity to engage across the agencies and then across disciplines. So providing the opportunities for the state engineers and architects to communicate and learn from the climate scientists is equally important. The next 2 recommendations are focused on and this is where you as agency secretaries can play a really important role, which is that ultimately the staff needs to be supported in order to do this work. And that means everything from workforce development, professional development, training for on-the-ground folks, understanding the full life cycle of the infrastructure. That's not something that people are trained in grad school. This is a science that's emerging. And so understanding how to implement that and train your staff to be able to do that is critically important. And then really the other side of that is having effective stakeholder engagement through the process. The 6th recommendation is focused on what we all thought the bill was going to focus on primarily, but turned out to be bigger, which is the updating of codes and standards. So not all agencies have the ability to update this within their own bodies. They have potential to need to, they often rely on international or standard-setting bodies, but where they can, they have guidelines and opportunities to sort of guide how their own agencies can move forward. So while we're updating the international standards, agencies themselves have the opportunity to influence their own ways of handling things to make sure that they're using sort of the best climate information in their moving forward. Recommendation 7 talks about the economic costs of infrastructure. When we defined infrastructure for this report, it was broader than just a bridge or a tunnel. It was really everything around that. It was the societal connection that it has. It's everything that builds the sort of the ecosystem around that particular piece of infrastructure. So ensuring that we understand if a bridge goes out, it's not just the cost of replacing the bridge. It's the roads that lead to it. It's the loss of people being able to get from point A to point B. It's the entire system around that bridge that needs to be considered. And we're not quite there yet with the science. The 8th recommendation, there are only 3 more. The 8th recommendation is, again, coming back to this importance of training and making sure that your workforce has what it needs to do its job. The top-down leadership is, of course, critical, but if you don't have the folks being able to actually implement it, then you're sort of stuck. So there's a lot of work on, a lot of discussion in the chapter, I believe it's chapter 9, if I recall, that focuses on how to effectively build your workforce so that it can incorporate this kind of new information in their planning. The 9th recommendation is that this working group really did a phenomenal job of touching on a lot of different important issues, but there was still more to be done. And this is going to be an evolving process where we need to be having these conversations more. In our work, we, for instance, didn't really get a chance to touch so much on the liability issues, which is clearly a very important issue. And so there's a lot of little things that still need to be discussed. And so we highly recommend the establishment of a standing climate safe infrastructure working group that can be sort of this convening body that can bring these discussions across agencies, across different disciplines to ensure that this work continues forward. And finally, it's this recommendation 10, which is bringing it down to the level where the people that are on the ground working, building the bridges and making the decisions, the construction, the implementation, that they have all the training that they need. But throughout it all, one of the things that I think that this report really pushed forward a lot was on the prioritization of social equity. So we developed this Venn diagram that was a way of trying to help prioritize how the state could consider, perhaps in its 5-year capital improvement plans, whatever mechanism it may be, how it can work to prioritize which infrastructure to build where. So we have a really good understanding of our climate risk. There's always more science to be done, of course, but we can start with what we have, which is really very good for, at the state, at the national level, at the global level. So we have a good understanding of our climate risk. We know our investment gap. We have some, just in state infrastructure, some 67 billion deferred maintenance that needs to be done on infrastructure. So we know where we need to do it. The third piece of that is identifying the communities that have been left behind. And where those three meet, in that very center, where you're able to build the infrastructure that addresses the biggest climate risk and has the most need and helps those communities that have been left behind, that's where we should be prioritizing our infrastructure investment. So to close, for this particular Strategic Growth Council, you represent the council, but you also are agency leads. And so I think it's a part and parcel sort of approach, right? Where you have your roles in your agencies, and then you have the role that SGC can do. And so we really advocate for this sort of two-pronged approach of planning for the best, working towards the best kind of future emission scenario that we can, but expecting potentially to not go that way and having a plan in place for that, but having that be done through a socially just lens. We need to recognize the importance of adaptation within your own agencies and prioritize that, and that's everything from the staff development and the workforce training. And then the third part is that the infrastructure that we talked about again, right? So it's not just the bridge, but it's everything around it, and all of your agencies interact and connect. So recognizing that when you're talking about infrastructure, it needs to be done in a way that you're thinking about all the cross connections and how they're interdependent and interconnected. And finally, this is definitely where the Strategic Growth Council has excelled in the past and can continue to do so, is in robust and meaningful and deliberate stakeholder engagement. It's just the two projects that Louise talked about before show already that leadership there. So there just keep it up. So I think with that, we'll close it, but we're happy to have any questions you may have, because there's a very long report that you should all look at and read in your spare time that has lots and lots of information for you. So thank you.
Okay, John?
I think I really appreciate it. I appreciate the work that was done and sort of how we got here. And I think part of this is truly trying to figure out where we go from here using this. And if, for those of us that have been on the council a while, not as long as Bob, but I'm completing my 8th year, that really early in the administration, the governor gave to the state agencies an executive order to integrate climate change in everything we do. The Resources Agency did the safeguarding plan, multiple versions over time to try to help with that kind of guidance. Then we had the 4th climate assessment that did in many ways the science underpinnings and backing for some of the issues that we're dealing with, and the questions that agencies were facing is, and many of them trying to follow those directives, is how does our electrical grid withstand spikes from heat waves? How are state buildings and schools and institutions best insulated from sea level rise, flood, and obviously fire, as we've talked about? How do buildings, this is a Santa Cruz resident, how do buildings have air conditioning in places where you're not used to having it or not used to ever feeling like you need it? How do our roads built to withstand greater rainfall, storm surges, higher temperatures, and how can our water system withstand sea level rise, as well as these other things. And throughout this work, I think what you've identified, what we've seen is many agencies are addressing these issues, and many of these agencies are working to do it. But the question is how is this all tied together, and how do we sort of make sure that there's some more, I don't want to say uniform, but one more consistent way that everybody is doing this, is aware of how everybody's doing it, and how do we do it going forward. And sometimes you don't know where to do it because you might be just even though you've planned, you're overwhelmed by the circumstances. Obviously fire, but some of the storms, some of the flooding, some of the things that are happening. And so it sort of brings us to the point, and unfortunately at the time of a administration transition, of trying to look how we're going to do this going forward. And I think it raises the issues of how we institutionalize this in departments and then coordinate. It raises the role of what the SGC is in doing that. It raises the question that you addressed and we've been talking about how you deal with disadvantaged communities and their vulnerability and their ability to be able to afford to deal with this. And sort of just the financial resources in general. And so I think that, I don't know if we're going to have a discussion here, but it sort of takes all that stuff that we've done in the lead-in for 8 years and then raises those questions for going forward and how we're going to do this. And maybe the one question I'd have, I might address to Louise, which is for the Strategic Growth Council. It seems like there's a couple of ways of doing this, and it's real easy to think somehow we'll just institutionalize this in the Strategic Growth Council, while the actual doing of all the sort of climate-safe infrastructures within all the individual departments. And how do you sort of address the issue of whether you should be a place that people collaborate or share information, and it still is done in the departments? I mean, how do you see that tension? How do you see the role for the Strategic Growth Council going forward in this? I thought I'd give you a softball.
Yeah, that's an easy one. I mean, I think it's an excellent question. I think we started, I worked with the Strategic Growth Council before I was in this position also, and how we looked at the 5-year infrastructure plan, which is, I think, part of our statutory role. And I think part of why this bill identified SGC as a place to bring this information. And then, we did work at OPR around the executive order implementation. And I think what becomes very clear is, one, that exactly what this report said is, it's much more than just the information need. It is the social, economic, and all these networks around infrastructure and all the planning and decisions that we do. So I think SGC has an opportunity to be a place, one, to reflect this in the work that we do as investors, in projects, to be a venue where we can help to collaborate and share information. I think also thinking about how it fits into the climate action team as well is really important, because ultimately it does become something that has to go down deep into all of our programs and investments. And so ultimately we want to get to where this is just how we do business. And so I think thinking through how SGC can support this with our engagement with local governments, providing a venue and forum for collaboration. I think we also have excellent examples of how to work with local communities and how to do stakeholder engagement and technical assistance and that support. So I think we need to really think through what the best opportunities for how to leverage our role is, but I do think there are several ways we can do that.
But the challenge is, and I know that Matt sees this in climate programs, if one of his departments was to direct the entire climate program, and yet I have CAL FIRE or I have Fish and Wildlife, and they're the people on the ground doing it, you want it to be institutionalized and directed within those departments, and sort of this outside direction is not going to help when that happens. And I think that applies to this in a way that you do the information sharing, but I don't think Caltrans is going to take direction from you on how to institutionalize certain things with regard to climate ready. So it's maybe I picked an extreme event, but I think that's the question that everybody is mulling is at what point is there direction, and at what point is it collaboration and facilitation and information sharing, and that's going to be the decision that's in front of the Strategic Growth Council going forward.
Right, and ultimately, there's not a solution that fits. What Caltrans does and what, other departments do might look different given their specific context. And I think part of our role is also to take that up into the work we do, where we're making investments in transportation, that we're learning and working with Caltrans. So I think it goes both ways in terms of, that we're not there to tell everybody what to do as much as also to reflect what the departments are doing.
Great. Thank you. That's very helpful.
All right. Other questions or comments? All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I should also mention that SB 246 directed OPR to create a adaptation and resilience clearinghouse, primarily focused on local governments, but it also includes infrastructure issues and is available at resilienceca.org. Okay. We have a public comment on this item. So Harvey, looks like Eder, want to come up and give us your comments?
Hello. My name is Harvey Eder. I'm speaking for myself and for the Public Solar Power Coalition. Been doing solar for over 45 years, and go back to Santa Cruz. Pardon?
It's funny. I was guessing to myself that might be true. You look like somebody that would be a constituent of mine.
I don't live there now. I'm out of LA now, but I was the first environmental studies student registered there in the fall of '70 with Dick Cooley. Yeah. Anyway. Okay. There's several things. One thing with housing and community development, working with them, to help low income and the homeless problem, there are two types of housing vouchers through HUD. The one that you pay to the owner or the management company that goes to the owner. And the other one is called a home ownership voucher. And that way it's actually paying the mortgage for you to buy into a house or a co-op or a condo. So this is something that local cities and counties can decide and do on their own, and a lot of areas in the state are doing them. Some of them aren't. And in this culture, I think I use the term equity, and the more equity you have, the more equal you are. Unfortunately, but there's some truth in that. So that was one thing. Got a general, well, on the equity issue, I know that there's been 350 energy equity looked at through different agencies a couple months ago, and had not been aware of that until just recently. And back in 80 and 81, did a consulting contract for the PUC with Commissioner Grimes on the first solar proceeding for solar hot water, $182 million. There was 10% marked out for low income. It was the first low income mark out, and now it's like 35%. So worked with Commissioner Grimes, the first black commissioner with the PUC. This is under Brown in the olden days, and did a low-income solar equity program. It was an assessment of all state, local, and federal programs and how to leverage them and complement them and try to do this through local governments. Also work with TURN. Sylvia Siegel came to Santa Cruz. I was a solar education specialist for Santa Cruz in 77 and 78. Taught a class there in 76. We had the Santa Cruz Alternate Energy Co-op. It was a spoof on the AEC. Anyway, we were around for a while. So, a lot could be done. For instance, like the state in South Coast using like natural gas, renewable natural gas, and there's problems in the waste systems from landfills, feedlots, and sewage of distributing drug-resistant antibiotics through the gas distribution system. For instance, the city of Santa Monica has a couple hundred buses, and rather than going solar electric, they're using landfill gas from Texas, put in the pipelines into their system. And you didn't have to report the deaths from this until very recently, first of the year. And that needs to be looked at. With natural gas, also there's a violation of the Health and Safety Code, 53,002B. It says legislative intent. This in the blue book that says, the air pollution laws of California, this section is not in there. From when it was passed by Roberti in 81, it's not there. And it says the legislative intent is to not have non-renewable natural gas, which 90% of it is, and it's fracked, brought into California. Also, the numbers on that the state uses, 450 CO2 equivalent, it's about twice that. There's been over a 30% increase in methane over the last 12 years in the 16 plan from South Coast. All the climate action plans and everything have to do, it has to do with methane over 20 years instead of 100, using 85, and there's a lot of problems that have to be dealt with, and there are opportunities there. Also been negotiating
so let me
for 5,000 Section 8 trucks
here
from BYD. They say they can manufacture them within a year. Solar electric trucks, and try to get
we'll give you
solar equity.
We'll give you a little bit more time on the general comments.
All right, thank you. Sorry.
That's all right. Thank you. Okay. So let's move to item 6, which is the Sustainable Agricultural Lands Conservation Program. And all yours.
Hi, good afternoon, Chair Alex and members of the council. My name is Virginia Jameson, and I'm here to give you a presentation on the Sustainable Agricultural Lands Conservation Program's 4th round of project selections. Wait for that to come up. Okay, so next slide, if you would. Oh, thank you. Okay, so our action that we recommend to you today is for you to consider awarding $47.9 million of GGRF funds to a total of 17 agricultural conservation easement projects, which will protect 10,271 acres of farm and rangeland. These projects will result in greenhouse gas emissions reductions and provide a variety of important co-benefits. There is a little bit of a remainder of funding after these full projects have been fully awarded, and so that remainder of about $150,000 can be used to fund alternate projects or roll over to round 5. Next, oh, I got this. Okay. So as you know, the purpose of the program is to complement the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities programs by preserving agricultural land in order to avoid the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the conversion of California's irreplaceable crop and rangelands to urban and residential development. This round, there were 2 types of eligible projects, which were strategies and outcomes grants for cities and counties to implement a variety of approaches to the conservation of agricultural resources, and also agricultural conservation easement grants to permanently protect specific agricultural lands under the threat of conversion. So in order to qualify for the SALC program, applicants had to demonstrate that lands are at risk of conversion and be able to quantify the greenhouse gas emissions to be avoided as a result of the projects. As you may recall, the California Emissions Estimator model calculates the avoided increases in vehicle miles traveled associated with the development potential of the subject lands based on a risk of conversion that's determined based on development patterns in the vicinity of the project. So next, I'd like to give you an overview of the projects in this round. We received 26 applications requesting $64.6 million in funding. Combined, these projects represent an estimated $112.4 million in total easement value. That includes the match funding that we required of applicants. Projects came from 15 counties, from San Luis Obispo to Siskiyou counties, and represent 8.7 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent proposed to be avoided. We'd like to note that we initially received 28 applications. However, 2 of the projects, totaling about $200,000, withdrew after their applications were submitted. So I'll tell you a little bit about the process. The pre-proposals were received on May 22nd, and based on those pre-proposals, staff provided feedback and technical assistance to applicants, which eventually resulted in stronger full applications in August. Staff then reviewed all applications for eligibility and readiness, and then scored the proposed projects based on selection criteria in the 2017-2018 guidelines. So I just wanted to give you an idea of the factors that we used to evaluate projects. We scored submitted projects based on their proximity to population centers, the emissions that would be avoided per acre as a result of the projects, co-benefits such as wildlife habitat, strategic proximity to other protected lands, the implementation of sustainable management practices on site. We also evaluated projects' likelihood to be completed within 2 years and potential environmental hazards near the project sites. And then staff also conducted site visits to verify the information provided in the applications. Oops, I think I went one ahead. So then we brought these projects to the interagency committee for review, and the committee members assessed the projects based on initial staff rankings and selected projects for recommendations based on specific factors, including geography, greenhouse gas emissions avoided, the threat of conversion, their relationship to previously funded SALC strategy grants, how effectively the proposals met the intent of the SALC program goals and objectives, and the cost. I should note that the 2017-2018 guidelines do give the committee discretion to make determinations based on these factors beyond just the selection criteria raw score that the staff determined. So the committee deliberated and discussed, partially funding some of the most expensive projects, but acknowledged that those projects provided some of the greatest greenhouse gas emissions benefits of all the projects submitted for this round. Therefore, the committee elected to fully fund the most expensive projects and selected 3 projects with lower threat of conversion as alternates. Given that projects may come in under the appraised value, thereby making funding available for alternate projects, the committee felt that this was a reasonable alternative. And so I'd like to give you some highlights of projects from this round. The first is a 1,300-acre project located in Yuba County. This project consists of 2 discontiguous parcels, in purple there on your screen, that are currently used to grow sunflowers, walnuts, and prunes. The property is considered at risk due to its proximity to the Plumas Lake subdivision. Located just 40 minutes north of downtown Sacramento, a conservation easement on this property would extinguish nearly 4,000 development rights and avoid more than 4 billion vehicle miles traveled over 30 years. So while this is an expensive project, this project also provides an opportunity to protect 1,300 acres of prime farmland with a single easement. It also avoids the second largest number of greenhouse gas emissions of all projects submitted this round and provides some ancillary habitat benefits along the vegetated water corridors there. Okay, another one I'd like to highlight, we had some projects in Santa Clara County. These are an example of how projects funded under SALC are now starting to build on each other. So this map shows three projects proposed to protect 251 acres of prime and locally important agricultural land in Santa Clara County. And these projects are being undertaken in pursuit of the Santa Clara Valley Agricultural Plan, which was funded by a 2015 SALC planning grant. That plan identified priority lands for conservation and created a regional policy framework to pursue protection of these lands. And then in 2016, SALC also funded an easement acquisition strategy for the county to protect priority agricultural lands. So these three projects in and of themselves would extinguish over 1,200 development rights. And as you can see, they're right on the edge of the city's sphere of influence of Gilroy. Okay, and so the last one I'd like to highlight for this round is in Shasta County. This is a property that's used for cattle ranching and beekeeping, and it would make permanent a portion of a designated greenbelt along Stillwater Creek. The landowner has implemented a carbon sequestration demonstration project on a portion of the property using a CDFA Healthy Soils grant. And the landowner also works with the adjacent Shasta Community College to create educational opportunities for students. The project would result in the removal of 2,226 development rights. So, as you may know, this is the first time that you will not be able to fund all of the projects. We've now got demand outpacing available funding for this program. So there were projects that we were not able to recommend for funding. And, generally, the projects that were not funded did also exhibit strong co-benefits, particularly with regard to habitat. Although in general, these projects also had extremely low greenhouse gas emissions avoided per acre. And so they scored low in the staff evaluation relative to other projects. And or they may have required additional work or development in order to be considered ready for funding. So keep in mind that SALC calculations on GHG emissions avoided are exclusively based on vehicle miles traveled. We don't look at carbon sequestration in the land base. So, we know that there's going to be some disappointed applicants out there, but we want to, make ourselves available to work with applicants whose projects require additional development in preparation for future funding cycles, or to provide feedback on why a specific project may not have been recommended for funding. So SALC program staff, and we're all here today, we wanted to recognize you. We know this is the last set of projects to be reviewed by this specific Strategic Growth Council, and we wanted to express our appreciation for the council's commitment to the program, your ongoing interest and support over the years, by giving you an overview of what the program has been able to accomplish thus far. So far, not including this round, you've funded $75.9 million worth of projects. You have protected over 24,000 acres of farm and ranch land. We have got another 55,000 acres still in the process of getting their conservation easement on them. That also doesn't include those recommended for approval in this round. And the program has also funded 8 plans at the city and county level that will protect countless additional farmland resources and contribute to the efficient use of local land. We have funded projects in 31 counties in California, and with your help, we'll, at the end of this, once these are complete, you'll have protected over 90,000 acres of farm and ranch land. So it's quite an accomplishment. And just, as a note, the SALC program, through the SALC program, the state of California has been able to significantly ramp up the number of ag land conservation projects that it's completed each year. So here you'll see the number of projects completed yearly under the California Farmland Conservancy Program in blue, and the number completed in only the last few years in SALC in yellow. So as the council is certainly aware, California continues to lose farmland at an average rate of 50,000 acres per year, or 1.1 million acres since 1984. And most of that loss has consisted of prime irrigated farmland. We now have research demonstrating climate change benefits of protecting farmland, as well as associated benefits of farmland for aquifer recharge, biodiversity protection, healthy food, and jobs, and more. So we see the SALC program as a real revitalization of the state's commitment to conserving our ag resources, and the stability over the program over the last few years has allowed our partners on the ground to plan and execute more projects than ever before. So a little bit more on program trends. As I mentioned, the program has experienced significant growth. We have demand strongly outpacing funding. We actually received initially in May $102 million worth of pre-proposals. And staff took those and gave feedback, and we ultimately got $64.6 million in applications. So all the projects that staff and the interagency committee have selected for your review today are great projects that protect not only farmland, but other important values, including our most fertile soils, habitat, and carbon sequestration opportunities. And some of these projects build on past strategies and outcomes, complement other protected areas, and prevent urban sprawl. Others protect watersheds and biodiversity. One kind of trend that we've noticed is that we have yet to receive any applications for projects south of San Luis Obispo County. Although we did receive one pre-proposal for a project in Ventura County in round 4, that one didn't turn out to be ready to move forward. So we've done outreach to local governments and nonprofits in Southern California to try to determine why we're not getting projects. And it seems like there are a variety of reasons for this that vary just county by county. So for example, San Diego has its own purchase of agricultural conservation easements program. Riverside is currently experiencing a fallowing of lands due to a shortage of farmers in its agricultural greenbelt. And Ventura has the SOAR initiatives that are protecting land there, and so folks aren't finding it necessary to purchase easements. And so there's just a lot of different reasons for this. We still want to continue to work to drum up projects there, and I think it's just going to take more staff outreach. So we wanted to give you also some snapshots of past projects that we're really proud of. And so the first one of these is a project in Solano County, right outside Vacaville on Highway 80. This is a project that where they farm multiple varieties of peaches, nectarines, and apricots, and it's within a half-mile of the city. So this project will allow the landowners to reunite the family farm and increase agricultural production on the property. It also contributes to the protection of the Cache Slough headwaters, which is a source of municipal water for Solano County. So this is a vicinity map of Salinas in Monterey County, and the purple polygons you see on your screen are SALC easement projects that are either completed or in process, and the blue ones are easements that have been funded by other sources like the California Farmland Conservancy Program. As you can see, the program builds on itself from year to year. Monterey County also received a Round 2 Strategies and Outcomes grant and is working to put together an ag land mitigation ordinance that will hopefully result in even more easements. So one of the biggest easements that we've done so far is one on the east, on the top right of your screen. You can see is a 9,000-acre project that extends from all the way from the valley floor to the top of the watershed. It encompasses irrigated lands of 318 acres and also rangeland in 11,000 acres of the Gavilan Mountains. So we've been able to accomplish a lot. We think that there are improvements that are still needed. The first and most obvious is to the strategies and outcomes portion of the program, which received no applications this year, despite our removal of the requirement that local governments put up the money for projects and get reimbursed at the end. To address this issue, we have some ideas for rebranding, and we also intend to increase our outreach and technical assistance for that portion of the program, and SGC has provided $200,000 for this purpose. Additionally, we'd like to expand the list of co-benefits to include biodiversity and public health, as well as improve the risk options and quantification methodology to improve the accuracy of our avoided greenhouse gas estimates. So with those things in mind, we've begun to address these issues in the draft guidelines for round 5 of the program, which is out for public comment until December 3rd, and which we will be presenting to you on December 20th. The reason that we're bringing this to you so soon is that some stakeholders were concerned that with the change in the administration, the new SGC would not meet for the first few months of 2019, potentially impacting the council's ability to fund projects in 2019. So in response to this concern, we expedited the revision and release of the Round 5 guidelines so that we maintain a consistent funding stream for ag land conservation. So with that, I'll bring us back to our recommended action.
Getting the sense that there's a transition that's going to happen. Thanks, Virginia. Questions for Virginia? Mike.
Yep. How is the cost or the value of the easements determined?
So they are determined by a qualified appraiser who will go out and appraise the properties. And so they will look at the price of the property subject to development, and then the price with a conservation easement inhibiting development, and the difference between those two numbers is the value of the easement.
One appraiser, one quote,
Yes.
one not negotiated, just
Yeah, okay. They do have to be reviewed by DGS, however, so it's not just the appraiser.
Okay.
Matt.
Well, I've got some questions, but before I get to them, I'd like to know if there are speakers on this item.
Yes, the way we've tended to do this is to ask informational questions, then have public comment, then have council comment.
Yeah, I'd like to hear the speakers before I ask the questions of the staff. So.
Okay, Bob.
Yeah, I brought this up before, and it has to do with the value of these easements on some kind of a common metric. It'd be great to know what the cost per metric ton avoided is, so that we can look at one easement against another. One may be a great value for the state, and the other one may be a lousy value for the state. But it's really hard to, because we essentially all the measurements that we put in here are dollars requested. Easement value, we put the greenhouse gases avoided, I guess, and the vehicle miles traveled reduced, but we don't show that in any way against how much money we're spending. So I would just encourage, it's too late for this one. I talked about this the last time we met, but maybe there's been enough turnover that there's lacks some institutional memory. But I think that, especially as you get more and more of these requests, there's got to be some way of judging one against another. And it's hard for me to tell based on the data that I've reviewed how one stands up against another. The other thing is that, when looking at some of these maps, and this is another point I brought up before, it looks like we're leaving some sort of agricultural islands completely surrounded by development. My understanding is that we wanted to try to approach this as strategically as possible and put up some, if we can set land aside and stop the progression of sprawl, then we accomplish a lot more than if the sprawl just goes on all around an island. And I think as we look at projects more in the future, we ought to do that with that kind of a lens. Ken said depends on who's selling it, and but we may have to we may end up rejecting projects that because we don't have enough money to spend. Ultimately, we don't have enough money to spend to protect all the farmland in the state. So we're going to have to be strategic, and it can't just be, because someone is willing to do it.
So I have a comment about that, but I want to actually.
Well, I was just going to say,
Yeah.
I was going to speak to that during our discussion, but we're going to have our discussion later.
Yeah.
So I just want to note a marker that I will speak to that when we get to our discussion.
Okay.
Me too. Okay, so with that, let's hear. Thank you, Virginia, and also to the Department of Conservation folks who've worked very hard on this program. We have a number of public comments on that, so let's do that. The first is Nicolo DeLuca, followed by Mark Landgraf.
Hello, my name is Nicolo DeLuca. I am here on behalf of the Land Conservancy of San Luis Obispo County. Just want to say thank you to the council, thank you to staff. Greatly appreciate your confidence in us, greatly appreciate the award. It is a bit sad that the council could change in the next couple of months, and you all have been very, very generous, and we have an open invitation to come down to San Luis Obispo County to either see the Pismo Preserve or other great projects. So thank you to you all, and thank you to the staff. Thanks.
All right, thank you. Yeah, Mark, followed by Jeremiah Leibovitz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the council. Mark Landgraf with the Santa Clara Valley Open Space Authority. The authority is the co-applicant with the County of Santa Clara on 3 of the projects recommended by staff for award. We would also serve as the easement holder should the funds be awarded and the transactions completed. According to the County Ag Commissioner's 2014 report, agricultural industries in Santa Clara County produce a total of $1.6 billion in output value and contribute a total of $830 million annually to the economy. I make this point because many think our county is the seat of Silicon Valley, not for its ag resources, but it is indeed rich with agricultural production and, in its remaining 24,000 acres of row crop farmland. The 3 projects in our county up for consideration today represent fully 1/3 of the lands prioritized for protection within the San Martin sub-area of the Santa Clara Valley Agricultural Plan, to which Ms. Jamison referred to earlier. Thanks very much to the council's previous award of a planning grant in 2015. That was the reason we were able to work with the county and complete this agricultural plan. The plan was approved by the Board of Supervisors in the county in 2017 and lays out 4 primary strategic areas for implementation. Those include land use policies and ordinances, improvement of agricultural infrastructure, branding and marketing programs, and an ACE program, an Agricultural Conservation Easement Program. Thanks to a follow-on strategy and outcome grant awarded by the council in 2016 that Ms. Jameson also referred to, we are working towards implementation of that ACE program. So how does this relate to the 3 programs on the slate for potential award today? Should these 3 pilot easement projects get awarded, the timing couldn't be better, as they would serve as a foundation for creation of a successful ACE program in our county, demonstrating early success and also serving as an educational tool both for education of landowners as well as local leaders on how a program can work successfully. We also know many neighboring landowners in San Martin are watching closely whether these pilot projects will be successful, and we're confident that once they do see success, that there will be many other landowners coming forward to request easements on their properties. So with that, I thank you for your consideration of awarding these projects among the many other very worthy projects on the staff recommendation list. Thank you.
Thank you. Jeremiah, followed by Stan Van Vleck.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. My name is Stan Van Vleck, and on behalf of my family, I want to say thank you very much for the consideration. It's really been a pleasure to work with your staff. They were thorough, thoughtful, and importantly, really described well what we are getting into and how to be able to participate in this program. Wanted to put a brief face on what you're looking to approve. and let you know that you do make a difference. For us in this example, and the issue that Councilmember Fisher brought up, we are very close to here. We're 20 miles to the east, right across the street from 10,000 people in Rancho Marietta. We've been in this region for approximately 162 years. We still have our covered wagon when we came over from Wisconsin. We raise a commercial cow-calf operation and hope to be here another 200 years. Candidly, when you have 4,000 houses across the street from you and they're surrounded and the only place they can go is Van Vleck, we really have one of two choices. We stay and continue what we're doing, but in California, financially, it's tough. So what we've tried to do is be very innovative, and it's been recognized by the national beef industry and the California beef industry and environmentalists. You'll see we have legislators supporting this. We have the environmental community, and that is still waiting until it's too late and selling out for the environment and selling out to developers, pardon me. We've decided to proactively put our land in easements, take those proceeds, invest those monies, and have them coming back to keep the business going. That locks up the land, and it creates a long-term ability for that family business to continue. And so I applaud you for what you're doing and your staff for their recognizing that. We have thus far, of the approximately 9 square miles that we have across the street from Rancho Marietta, this will take us to about 30% of that, so we're still working on that. Our goal is to be able to set aside 80% of that land. So we look forward to working with you, and yes, you are making a difference, and hope to be able to continue being here in this process 200 years from now, and our family being able to say thank you and part of that relationship. So thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Jeremiah Leibowitz, and I'm representing the California Rangeland Trust, and wanted to follow Stan simply because we are the land trust that is partnering with him in trying to achieve those family goals and family objectives. And we're looking at possibly a 4 to 5 phase project, of which what we're working on now represents phase number 2. So wanted to extend, on behalf of Rangeland Trust, our thanks to the Strategic Growth Council. That project that was put up on your screens east of Salinas is one of our projects, the 9,000-acre ranch. And we've got an additional 4 projects that have been currently funded by the program that we're actively pursuing right now. It made a huge difference on the working landscapes that we're responsible for across the state. And I also want to just give a public thanks to the staff that administers the program. From my personal perspective as to why those numbers on your chart and the demand has gone up, quite frankly, the competence and the knowledge of the folks that are administering this program on behalf of the Strategic Growth Council, by far probably one of the best, if not the best, in the state agency programs that fund these types of projects. It's a joy to work with them. They know what they're doing. They're very common sense oriented. They understand it from the land trust and the landowner's perspective, and look forward to continuing our partnership with them in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Lauren Hubert, followed by Shelton Dothett.
Hi, I'm Lauren Hubert. I'm the Conservation Director with Sierra Foothill Conservancy, a regional local land trust serving the vernal pool to the Sierra Crest and the Central Valley to the Central Sierra Foothill. And today I'm here with our partnering landowner, Sharice McKinney, wave your hand, and Kevin Knowles from the Conservation Land Group, and our assisting consultant who can be here, Volmar Natural Lands Consulting. And this will be the third project, if we're awarded the third project that's funded by the council. And I just wanted to say thank you for the consideration and the opportunity to apply. It's been a big change for us and our partnering landowners throughout the region to have funding for working land, specifically to highlight the value and conserve the value of agriculture. And I think I wanted to echo what CRT said about the staff of all the agencies we work with. This staff is probably the most helpful and gives us the best ability to produce the best projects, which I think is probably why you have so many fundable projects. And as to the new guidelines, I also wanted to comment on the thoughtfulness of the listening tour that the staff did over the summer and how we saw the feedback that we gave in our listening sessions reflected in the current guidelines, the draft guidelines that are out right now. So thank you again.
Thank you. Shelton, followed by Tracy Ellison.
I want to thank you again. This is our second year for applying, and I'm the Executive Director of the Feather River Land Trust. And I just wanted to say that Sierra Valley, which is our current focus of our efforts, it's remote, but we are faced with dramatic growth on the horizon. Reno is coming our way, and I just want to thank you again for your view of the future, and to know that land values change quickly. We just found out last week we have 2 ranches that have been optioned by developers in our valley. And the valley has 160 separate ranchers. About half of them currently are participating in one easement or another. So we're very grateful for that legacy of conservation. But I've come from Southern California. I'm new to the Sierra Nevada, and I've lived the developer. I've seen the bulldozers. And I just want to thank you again for looking forward and letting us move quickly when land values are low. I don't want to understate that I disapprove of the need to invest in areas where land values are high, but it's nice to have a mix. So again, I want to thank you all for considering our second round of proposals, and we do have alternates this year, so I kind of feel like I'm on the side of the ball game waiting to come in too, if there's an opportunity. And I just want to make this one last statement, and that is that, again, you'll hear this over and again, but your staff that worked on this program have been exceptional, and we have a couple job openings soon, so we'll be looking for them, okay? So thank you again.
Thanks a lot. Tracy, followed by Jeannie Merrill.
Good afternoon, Chair Alex and council members. I'm Tracy Ellison with Solano Land Trust. I'm a program manager and project manager for the Brazelton Ranch in Solano County that was mentioned yet again today. We were a third round recipient. We'll be protecting that 2,200 acres in the next few months. With the conservation easement, we fortunately met our match with the NRCS program, ASEP-ALE, and we'll continue with this project and close it, like I said, in the next couple of months. I wanted to chime in on the fact that, how do we move forward? The Land Trust and other conservation agencies like us, we're the ones out there beating the dirt, as you would say, on the ground, talking to these landowners. And I've said it once before that if the opportunity isn't there to show progress, to show availability of the funds, and that these projects are closing, sometimes the climate or the market doesn't really keep the attention of a landowner to consider a conservation easement. And so if we're in round 4, now into round 5, I have 2 projects in the pipeline for round 5. And so that wouldn't have happened if we didn't have the continuation. We all have a goal. There needs to be an outcome to that in order to reach the goal, and then we have to continue with the process to get that outcome to reach that goal. And so having the continued funding, having the partnerships that we have with the DOC and staff, and continue the communication with our landowners, it all comes together to reach that goal. So I just want to thank you again for your continued support of the program. It's in its infancy still, and so I know there's a lot of goals that we're talking about up here, and I think they can be reached, something that you're going to talk about here soon. But again, this is a young program, and it's growing, and so that continued funding is really, truly needed. And we say thank you and congratulations to those that are available for funding today. Thank you.
Thank you. Jeannie, followed by Charlotte Mitchell.
Jeannie Merrill with the California Climate and Agriculture Network. Our coalition of sustainable and organic agriculture organizations has been advocating for a long time about the importance of farmland conservation as a climate change strategy. And I think due to the leadership of this council, you've actualized that in pretty profound ways. So I wanted to thank you for that work. I'll echo The other sentiments of the staff have been excellent to work with, but the council has really provided the study leadership and framework in which we can really make this program work. I think the challenges going forward will be ongoing stability of funding, so glad to see the staff hustled so that we could be looking at finalizing program guidelines in December and getting the 5th round out in 2019. That will be important. This comes at a time, as you all may be familiar with, as the state is grappling with the Natural Working Lands Climate Change Implementation Plan. How are we going to realize climate strategies that are focused on our forests, our wetlands, our ag lands? And as part of that plan, the discussion is around cutting that loss of 50,000 acres of farmland a year by anywhere from 50 to 75%. That's pretty profound, ambitious, but necessary goal, and SALC is an essential component to that. So figuring out how to make it even more robust will be important. I think the changes proposed on what were once called the strategy and outcome grants will be important. They've not been an attractive component of the program to local government, but that we can fix that. And we're interested in working with staff and local government partners to figure out the best path forward on that. To the point of what's the bang for the buck, the LAO has done an analysis on return on investment of the various climate change investments. I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head for SALC, but typically the Natural and Working Lands programs have fared quite well in that analysis on return on investment, so happy to look that up and share that with you all. And then I think it's important that as we think about, we agree we don't want islands of protection. We are interested in, are there opportunities moving forward with SALC and infill development, sustainable communities, if we might look at other regional approaches, similar to how we think about TCC, but bringing in farmland protection along with infill development and how we might better marry those two. I think there's a real opportunity there. But again, thanks very much, and we look forward to coming back in December and talking about 2019.
Okay. Charlotte, followed by Katie Patterson.
Good afternoon, Council. Charlotte Mitchell with the California Farmland Trust. While this sounds redundant, again, thank you for your commitment to funding good agricultural conservation easements. As an organization, we have protected more than 15,600 acres of farmland down the Central Valley and worked with over 60 family farmers to ensure that their lands continue in production agriculture, providing the food and fiber that not only feeds us here locally in this region, the state, but across the world. I echo the fact that we have a great funding program and allows us to do great projects in a conservation easement level. But in order to ensure that we don't build islands, I think good local land use planning is essential, and good farmland protection policies, both at the city and the county level, are essential to complement the efforts that we're making here today in this funding mechanism. So again, thank you, and thanks to the staff that implement the program.
Okay. Katie, followed by Katrina Deloso.
Good afternoon, council members. My name is Katie Patterson. I'm the state policy manager for American Farmland Trust, also known as AFT. And AFT has been active in California for over 30 years. We're an organization aimed to improve natural resources, protect farmland from urban sprawl, and we are also looking to prepare the next generation of farmers. So a lot on our plate here, as you have on yours. As a land trust organization, we currently hold 140 easements across the nation, with 22 of those located in California. And we've been an active partner with many of the land trust and organizations that are here within the room. So we appreciate the opportunity to be here and to complement the program here. AFTC's SALC program is a necessary cornerstone in California conservation efforts. Not only does it reduce these greenhouse gas emissions and air pollutions, but it also helps to sustain agricultural lands that produce food, healthy food, store carbon, and sustain our economy. We're appreciative of the ongoing funding effort for the SALC program through the cap and trade program proceeds, and those have led to nearly 80,000 acres being protected. But more can be done. The current funding level only captures roughly half of the demand of the program as it exists today, leaving so much opportunity left on the table for willing and eager participants. So we want to be a partner in that going forward with your staff. There's bold carbon neutrality goals and bold greenhouse gas goals, and we can't afford to leave these opportunities out there. So we want to, again, partner with the Department of Conservation staff, who's been doing an excellent job stewarding this program, and many of the other partners here in the room as we go forward into the next round of proposals. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. Katrina, I did see you want to talk on a different item, so we'll get to you next. Okay, a procedural matter first. There's a recommended action from staff, so before we have council comment, I think it would be appropriate to...
Oh, I wanted to second it.
Okay, so we... All right, we have a motion and a second. So now open for council comments. Matt, you've been waiting patiently.
Well, thank you. And let me note first off that we did have an auction in the cap and trade program this month, and it brought in over $800 million for the state. So I think we can, I know it always makes the Air Resources Board nervous if I make projections, but I will just say generally it looks like there will be funding for this program in the future through the cap and trade program. And I'm pleased to say, you know, that it does seem it's a good thing to have it over prescribed and have more applicants. I think that's a good sign too, that there's interest in the program, and I think that it really is a very, very important program. You know, I've been looking at what we can do to protect agriculture since I started in this business back in 1979 with agricultural protection policies in the Coastal Act. And it's incredibly important that we retain agriculture in the state of California and find ways to do it. And given rising land costs, it is very, very important to have easement programs such as this. So I think it is a very, very important program. I wanted to hear the comments from the representatives of the various participants in this round of funding, simply because I was a little concerned here that we need to give more direction. And let me say that I'm very pleased to hear the positive comments about the staff, because that allays some of my concerns. And you can tell that a lot of staff work has gone into this. So I was questioning whether we needed more explanation in this situation between why some projects were being recommended for funding and why some others were not. We had some general discussion during the presentation that talked about, well, and generally we think that a project that has a greater reduction in greenhouse gas emissions long-term is one that would be preferable for funding. And yet, as I look at some of the projects, some of them have very, very large projections for reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. We're also told that we have some discretion. For example, if we want to make a decision based on regional differences, we don't want to have too many projects in one region of the state, or we want to spread it out to make sure that all regions of the state can benefit. I think that that's a good thing, and certainly I would want to exercise that discretion. But I sort of have to read through some of the analysis in here to try and figure out why some of these projects did better than other projects. And I think at the end of the day, given the comments that I've heard, I won't ask for greater explanation here, but I would recommend to staff as we look at this in the future and as we look at the guidance, that we draw that. We've got the standards, we've got the recommendations. What we need to do is do a little better job drawing the relationship between what the standards are and why the recommendation here. And if I'm being asked to exercise my discretion for one of these other factors, you know, geographical diversity or something like that, then it would help me to know that and just have a little bit more information. And I also think that that would be beneficial for the program, because I think particularly if this becomes more competitive, as more property owners look to this program, they're going to want to know with greater specificity how it is we make these decisions, why we make these recommendations. So just an observation, it would be helpful for me to have a little bit more specificity, and most of the information is here, and I will say that I appreciate that staff, I'm not used to people paying attention to my comments, but they seem to have paid attention to one of my comments in an earlier meeting where I asked for some more information and maybe a map to show us where these are so we can see where these projects are. So I appreciated the information that was here. It's just a little bit more in future rounds to sort of, as I said, tie the standard to why this particular recommendation. But with that, it seems like we've got some appreciative landowners out there. I don't want to hold this up. And it sounds like we've got some very, very good projects out there. The last thing I'll say is I understand that and it may be that Secretary Laird or Secretary Ross want to speak to this. I understand that whole issue where you've got an area that is surrounded by easements, but there are areas that are not. It really does go to the nature of this program. You do need to look for willing sellers. And sometimes, you know, it really is, can you preserve enough of those areas so that you've reached the tipping point, but a good tipping point, in that there's enough area that is going to be preserved for agriculture, that you know that agriculture in that area is going to be viable. That makes it more likely that that piece of property that's a whole is not going to be thinking about development or is not attractive to developers in the future. So I'm not so concerned about the whole so long as I can take a look at that, the agricultural economy in that area, in that region. So I think this program is very important. I appreciate the council indulging me on my comments, and I think I'll wrap up with that.
So real quickly, I asked a similar question of staff that you raised in terms of there were 6 projects that didn't make the cut. And there is a pretty clear explanation for each. I remember 2 of them had very low GHG emissions. One of them was not a complete application in some form, and the other 3 had a similar explanation that was quite convincing. I agree with you. It probably a little more in the packet would be helpful. So, Secretary Ross.
Thanks. So I want to thank the staff, and I want to thank everyone who spoke today. And I have shared this with Louise. It breaks my heart that we're not getting more local governments seeking out doing planning grants. I think what Santa Clara County has done, and now this is my perception, but what they have done is use the planning grant and strategies and outcome grants, and they brought a whole community together to go, if we want agriculture to be viable here, in 20 years, what will it take? And that's the same kind of visioning that we've asked transformative climate communities to do, and that's the only way I think that we can make this work. And to go to a comment that Jeannie made, it's how do we marry what we're doing in the cities with what's happening in that countryside as a whole community and those multiple benefits that we're achieving, including fire resiliency in addition to climate resiliency. So I don't know how we get the word about those success stories that have come from how they've used planning grants and document what the benefits of that have been and how it's leading to this and that and that. But I think it's an important piece of having folks, since we're asking them to update their general plans and to include climate, that this is a strategy that it will, I would love to do it on a statewide basis, but the diversity of our ag, a lot of ag is site-specific, and so having more local governments and their partners see the value of doing this and seek out these kinds of grants, it's an important tool, and I'd love to help you find ways to expand the use of that. Thanks.
Thank you. We got a virus notification during your...
Yeah.
All right. John?
I really appreciate everybody's comments thus far because I think they're right on, and let me add to them. And what I thought I'd do is sort of as one of the people that was the real impetus for this program, I would briefly look back to sort of talk about what it means about where we go from here, because just getting this in that very first budget was hard fought. It just was hard fought. There were a lot of institutional reasons why people did not want this to be done, and we got it in. And I think our original idea was to do both planning grants and the easements, and to try to figure out a way that we would leverage local governments into this whole concept, especially since in the economic meltdown that's now already 8 or 9 or 10 years ago, the state budget pulled back from the Williamson Act program in the way that it had historically been supported. So how, under the new prism of really focusing on climate, would we do this? And there were real tussles with ARB over how this was quantified, because I think all the natural and working lands we were quantifying for the first time, and we really had to fight to figure out how to do it. And we could not get those local governments in a way, because in part, getting a planning grant was contingent on staying in the Williamson Act until they could get the planning grant and figure out what to do. And so we weren't as successful, and yet the Santa Clara one that has come up is the one place where exactly that happened. And it was sort of some planning that then led to it, and you could see the connection, and it spoke to the wisdom of what we were trying to do but couldn't totally successfully do. And I think, to speak for a second to Bob's point, Matt and Karen talked about it, but there's this more practical institutional thing that when local governments do their planning and they do their sphere of influence, and I served 30 years ago with a guy on the Santa Cruz City Council who could never pronounce sphere. So we were always in these meetings and he would refer to the spear of influence. And I would always envision these Roman and Greek warriors standing at the city's boundaries, protecting against the development. But when the spear of influence, as he described it, are developed, which is where in a general plan there might be growth outside the city limits, that's actually what we saw in that map of Salinas, is we saw sort of where it might grow. And so when you, even if it's checkerboard, even if it's not a complete wall, whenever you pick up the different pieces that are on the other side of the sphere of influence, you are protecting and underlying the sphere of influence in a way that the growth won't spill across there. So it is a statement that is also the tipping point for other people to realize this sphere of influence is real. The development is not going to come here. It is probably in our interest to attempt to do this. And so it actually is a victory for that, against sprawl and for the non-development, to start to get those parcels that are there for exactly what it does send. So now that's where we're going, and I hope we approve this. I mean, where we've been, and I hope we approve this, and then where we're going, because we have a new administration. And one thing that gives me great faith that will go somewhere well is that Kayla E. Bright is moving into managing the Ag Lands program and those greater programs at the Department of Conservation. And I think he and I have talked, and in some ways my vision is that we had to work so hard to get this off the ground. We had to work so hard to demonstrate its efficacy to ARB, and then we had to basically accept who was ready to come to us rather than be strategic and decide where, as Bob pointed out, where the priorities need to be. And now I think we can move to that next level, is how do we decide, how do we facilitate the planning and decide where the most strategic places are and be affirmative in how this is done. And I think that's what the next stage of this program is. And that actually some of it we can't fully deduce here, but if somebody's on the ground working with the people in Salinas, looking at those parcels, and as I've said before here, the Monterey County example is actually a very good one because while they, over 20 years, they fought over 5 different versions of a general plan update. I think they went to the voters 4 times. They could not do it for 20 years. And quietly, the Ag and Historic group there is doing conservation easements to make sure that there wasn't growth in certain areas into prime ag land in Salinas and Marina and down the Salinas Valley. And the example I always use and overuse is King City, where on one side it's rangeland, on another side it's a river, on 2 sides it's prime ag land. And they moved and really did easements and facilitated easements over time on the 2 sides that are prime ag land. So if King City is ever going to grow, it's going to be into the lowest impacted ag land. And that's, in fact, what they're doing. And that's the kind of stuff that this program facilitates, except now we really have to, 9 years on for no Williamson Act money from the legislature and this being institutionalized, take it to the next step. And I think that's what Kaylee is going to do. I think that's what they'll work with the SGC staff and decide how to make sure that there are priorities and that we are aggressive rather than just taking what comes to us and protecting ag land. So I'm really pleased with what this group has done with this program and institutionalizing it, taking it here. And it's going to be the challenge to get to that next phase after we approve the motion that's in front of us today.
Other comments? Well, fortunately for you all, John said most of what I wanted to say. But I do want to remind everybody that this program was originally envisioned as sort of an interlude until the Williamson Act was updated and reformed, and that hasn't really fully happened. So hopefully that is on the docket. But there are some other pieces of the overall strategy, one part of which used to be called advanced mitigation planning, which is the conservation piece of the open space, and that now is in law and is moving forward. There's a very big effort around data and mapping to identify in even more detail the prime agricultural lands and the relationship to water and to areas of better for development and better for open space. And so I think all of these things work together, and now because SALC has remained in place and the funding has improved year over year, it's become an integral part of how I think we go forward in the state. So I have to say I'm really pleased to hear the response and to see it, and I will echo everybody's comments in thanking the Department of Conservation and the SGC folks. So thank you all very much. All right, we have a motion and a second, so all those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? All right, passes unanimously, and you're funded. So, all right. Wahoo. Next item is informational update on transformative climate communities. Saharnaz.
Good afternoon, council members. My name is Saharnaz Mirzazad. I'm Transformative Climate Communities Program Manager at the Strategic Growth Council. I'm here to update the council on round 1 TCC grantees. As you heard from Luis, soon we'll be back to the council to recommend the second round of TCC grants, and we thought that it's appropriate to update the council on our progress on round 1 and challenges that we have faced since the awards have been made. So round 1 grants were awarded on January 29 and $140 million to 3 locations: Fresno, a neighborhood of Watts in Los Angeles, and Ontario in Southern California. Since the awards were made, the staff started quickly to see what's the next step, and the first step was developing a grant agreement, which we didn't have at our hand when the awards were made. And as you know, TCC is a very complex program. It has like multiple projects, and it was a challenge how this will come under one grant agreement. And with the help of the Department of Conservation and multiple state agencies, we were able to develop a template of the grant agreement and send it to the grantees on September 4th of this year. It took us a couple months, but we have a template now that we hope that for the next round we will be able to use, and this process will be much shorter. But I want to thank all the agencies involved during this process, including Department of Community Service and Development, Department of Transportation, Air Resources Board, Department of Water Resources, and Forestry and Fire Protection, and Department of Resource Recycling and Recovery for their help to figure out how this grant agreement needs to be developed. One of the main projects that is funded under the TCC is housing project. And we had some challenges since the awards were made that we want to keep you posted how it's shaped into the grant agreements. Last year, end of last year, the federal government passed a tax reform that resulted in the reduction of the tax value of the tax credit and resulted in a hole in the financial of housing projects that were submitted to our grants. We work with HCD to figure out how we can resolve that issue, and since we are on a timeline to build these housing projects and on a 5-year timeline, we noticed that we have a path forward that is somehow different than HSC program as it's funded right now. In HSC program, HCD gives a letter, a award letter to the grantees, which by using that letter, they go to the bank and take a commercial loan. Sorry, the construction loan for developing the housing projects. And when the project is completed and they get the certificate of occupancy, they come back to the state and request for the release of the grant to the developer. During this process and when the construction loans are taken, there is a quite amount of good amount of interest that is paid for that construction loan. So we figured out if we can change this model to be able to give this money in form of grant versus loan, we will be able to eliminate some money that goes to the interest to the banks. So that has changed from the HSC program to TCC. We are releasing the funds in 25% increments to the lead applicants in the cities, and HCD helped us to make sure that the lead entities who are signing the grant agreements are capable of being the loan agency on the behalf of the state. And we were lucky that we had 3 public agencies that were all sophisticated enough to be the loan agency on behalf of the state and monitor this whole process and be able to reduce the cost of development and fill that gap. So that's one thing that I wanted to point out to council, the change and how that results in the grant agreement. And after we sent these templates to our awardees, we received around 250 questions and comments about the template that we reviewed with legal people and different program staff in different state agencies, and it resulted in changes in the grant template, which is the final version that we have in hand right now. Next. We simultaneously started the pre-contract consultation phase, and major tasks that we had during this phase was reviewing the proposed projects and transformative plans for compliance with the TCC guidelines, reviewing the projects for their feasibility in detail, like making sure that they are feasible projects, addressing the conditions of the Transform Fresno application, as I want to remind you all that the Fresno project was awarded based on some conditions, and staff spent quite a lot of time to make sure that we address those conditions before signing the grant agreements. We also worked with these applicants to make the 5% reduction for the state admin fee, which wasn't reflected in the applications. So Transform Fresno, their application was $73 million, and the available fund for them was $66 million. Ontario, $35 million. The available amount was $33 million, and What's Rising Collaborative was $35 million in the proposed budget, and they had to come to $33 million. I will start from Ontario project, which is the easiest one and most straightforward, and then Watts, and then Fresno, which will take quite a lot of time to update you on what has changed since we came here to recommend the awards. Ontario Together project, as I mentioned, they had to cut around $1.5 million to be able to meet the 5% reduction. The next slide, please. Decided that one of the city-led project called Downtown Ontario Connector is the project that they want to cut from the package, which was constructing 1 mile of Class 2 bike lane on San Antonio Avenue, downtown mobility hub. This is like approximately $1.8 million, and they were able to meet the reduction that we requested them. There was one other change in their project, which their Ontario Carbon Farm location didn't work out, and they had to identify a new site to move that project, and that's reflected in the new in the grant agreement. Next slide. Watts Rising Collaborative is the next project. The approach of Watts to how to cut the budget was different than other two locations. They had more of a cutting small amounts from different projects to meet the requirements. And a major change is that their Compton Creek project, which was planting 350 trees, is eliminated. The budget was around $89,000. The Solar Watts project, the scope has changed from installing solar electric systems on 300 homes to 60 homes. And they were able to eliminate $213,000 in budget for that. And the energy efficiency retrofit project, the scope has changed from 300 homes to 208 homes. Next slide. And the other project that had significant change was the Walk Bike Watts project, which the scope of the project has changed to remove the metro station intersection improvements, which resulted in about $1 million in budget cut. And the other one is Green the Blue Line, which was to create a tree canopy along the Blue Line Metro, which reduced from 400 trees to 200 trees, and they're now focusing on the first last mile Blue Line corridor, and it resulted in a $70,000 budget reduction. Next update is about Transform Fresno, which is the main reason that we are standing here, and we would like to make sure that we are on the right track. So we started the review of Fresno in March, and that was the first review that we went down to Fresno. We met with every single project lead. We reviewed their project and asked for missing information or backup documentation for what they have proposed in their proposal. And we had at least 2 or 3 meetings with each of these projects, and we provided technical assistance how they can improve their projects and conform with the TCC guidelines. We also provided written feedback on transformative plans, and I want to remind you that they didn't meet any of the transformative requirements when we recommended them for getting the grant in January, and we provided detailed comments how they can meet the guidelines for transformative plans. The second review happened during the September and October. We had a short gap in between because we didn't have the grant agreement at hand at the time, and some of these conditions really were dependent on the grant agreement. We went back in September and with the review of the revised version of the projects and identified approximately $6 million in ineligible costs in proposed projects. This was the first attempt to help the city with making cuts. And we hold meetings with the project leads for providing information on why the costs are ineligible. After we made the recommendation and we met with the city and the partners whose the project that had cut went back to the city and asked the city to be able to work with the state, again, identify eligible costs that they can use for, in that project, in the budget that they initially asked for. So the city came back to us and said, we would like to ask you to help these projects to find eligible costs in their projects, and we will identify another way to cut the requested budget cut. So at the same time, we also notified the transformative plan leads on how to address issues, identifying a potential pathway forward, and connected them with the leads, connected the leads with the subject matter experts to make sure that they have the resources to understand what they really need to do. And this is more in the context of workforce development piece, which we saw as significant challenges in their application, and they didn't, we had like go back and making sure that they understand what is expected from them and how to address the issues that was raised during the reviews. The final review was in November. We worked with the projects that had ineligible costs by holding meetings and providing written feedback on reallocating the funds to eligible costs. And we developed a scope of work and budgets for the grant agreement. So this is the process that we have taken in Fresno. With that in mind, can I have the next slide? I want to give you an overview of what has changed in the Fresno package. We had quite extensive feedback on their Memorandum of Understanding, which basically the governance documents how the partners will work together and how the public will be involved. They had significant issues on the public engagement and the community oversight. We had to work with the city to convince them to change the status quo and making sure that the community is involved. Some of the recommendations that we have provided are based on the guidelines. Some of them are more recommendations based on the best practices, and they accepted some of them, and some of them were not included in the final MOU. The community engagement plan, basically, they have to redo the whole plan. It was really challenging to do it only with the state staff. We asked them to engage the community in developing the community engagement plan and have some experts that can help them. And we are allowing them to use some of our money, maximum of 5%, to develop the community engagement plan during the first quarter after the grant agreements are signed. With the workforce development, none of the lead applicants for those projects were able to demonstrate that they can meet the requirements of financial and management capacity. So we had to ask them to find lead applicants that have that experience and the capacity, and work with them to develop a workforce development plan as a deliverable of the first quarter. And for all those plans, we are requiring them to be approved by SGC before moving forward. And finally, it's the same with the displacement avoidance plan. That will be part of the whole community engagement plan development. They also need to have a displacement avoidance plan that will be deliverable of the first quarter of the grant agreement. So from the projects, when the city of Fresno decided that they want to cut one of their own projects to meet the required budget cut, they requested to cut high-speed rail connectivity project, one of the two projects that they had to, they used to meet the requirements of being connected to the high-speed rail. There is the other one, that Chinatown urban greening, that's in the south side of the project that has been eliminated. Based on that project, they still can meet the requirements of our guidelines. This resulted in $7 million of cuts, which they can basically move forward right now, and they are in a good standing. Next. Other major changes, Chinatown housing development. There was one major issue with this project. It was close to a fire tower that is being used for training the fire marshals, and it was set on fire every day for the training purposes. And we basically have been negotiating with the city that you can have a fire tower close to a big housing development, and it took us a couple months back and forth, and the city is committed to remove that fire tower, and it's a condition of our grant that the money will not be spent if the city doesn't remove that fire tower. The next project is Changing Lives with the trees in Southwest Fresno. The Tree Fresno, which was the lead on this project, has to opt out because they didn't know that some of the costs that they put together for this project is not eligible under our program. So they said that, sorry, we can't do it. So the city took over the project. They re-scoped the whole project, and now they are planting 295 trees versus 1,000, and the city is the lead versus Tree Fresno. Next slide. Southwest Community Food Hub. This is one of the projects that is pretty interesting. They were using an interesting leverage fund source, direct public offering, or DPO, as they call it, to raise leverage. And by the time that we were starting to negotiate with them how this project will work, they didn't have the amount that they claimed that they will raise through the DPO, and we asked them to change the project to right sizes to amount that they already have and they have in the committed leverage fund. It resulted in eliminating the grocery store from the food hub and only do the food rescue and distribution center. And their high efficiency water energy appliance project was totally ineligible because they were asking for purchasing a new fridge for this center, which is not something that we had in our guidelines. And, but there was no change in the community orchard, significant one. There was some reallocation because they asked for money for the parking lot, which is also ineligible, and they allocated something else. Next project, park at MLK Magnet Core. The money that was available from the Tree Fresno project that I mentioned, there was around like $900,000 that the city took over that project. They moved that money to this park. They had like some gap in funding for this park close to the city college. This is the new amount of this park, like the budget for this park, and we asked the city to give us a commitment letter that they will be funding. They will be committed to fund the rest of the gap in the project budget. ERP Green Toddler Park, I want to remind you, this is the toddler park, but it was in the back of a church, close to the highway. We had a lot of back and forth with this partner, what we should do. We're really concerned about the exposure of the highway pollution and how it potentially can impact toddlers. So we asked them to complete an exposure risk assessment as a condition of the grant, and the revision of the project scope to include any mitigation measures, and SGC needs to approve that before the park is being constructed. Inside Out Community Garden also had a problem with their location. They had to change their location, and there's a new location in the final package. Next one. And Fresno City College had a substantive amount in constructing surface parking that we notified them that it's ineligible cost, and they moved it to additional bicycle and pedestrian trail amenities and green study spaces. And finally, City of Fresno didn't have enough budget in their admin, and we asked, since it's very important for us to make sure that they are capable of managing this project, we asked them to find a way to increase their admin budget, and we asked the project to all the projects to cut 2% to donate to the city admin budget, so they will have a good project manager in place moving forward to make sure that this project will be completed. So with that in mind, I want to can I have the next slide? Some future considerations. This Fresno project was a really good example of the old challenges that TCC can have, and with that in our mind, staff thinks that it's very important to have planning grants and making sure that the communities have time to think through these projects when they're putting together a TCC application. That's something that we really would like to see change in the TCC program. We also need, on the program staff side, we need to do more vetting on implementation grants for making sure that they're ready and they have the capacity to implement. And also shift the process to ensure that the implementation grants will really result in transformation, and they're not just a collection of dispersed parts of a project that they come together as because there is some organization behind them to advocate for that project. So I would like to answer any questions that you might have and any feedback that you might have for staff.
Yeah, maybe I'll start this time. I've got a few questions. First, sort of an observation. I mean, it was the first round of it. Fresno was by far the largest grant. There was a change in administration sort of in the middle of for the city. But there are a lot of changes, and we also knew that there would be changes given the nature of this, and that's built into the guidelines that the staff needs to be able to negotiate, et cetera. But, some of this seems fairly substantial and a little frustrating to see. I'm wondering if you feel like you're now in a place where the effort is going to go forward. Do you have partners that you can work with? I guess it's mostly related to Fresno, but I'm curious about all three.
We are really in a good position for Watts and Ontario. We never had very substantial challenges there. It was pretty straightforward. The main thing was that we didn't have the grant agreement at hand to accelerate this process. But when we had that, when everybody understood what are the terms of our grant is, it was pretty easy to find path forward. Fresno challenge, first of all, I want to give a credit for City of Fresno from where they started and where they are right now. I don't want to compare them to Watts or Ontario. They had a start from a very challenging point from the they didn't have a good relationship with the community, and there were a lot of there isn't trust between the city and the community there, and it made it very challenging for city to lead the project. But I think during the last couple of months, we were able to somehow ease that process and be able to build some trust between the city and the partners, and making sure that they will be able to have some communication together to implement this project. I'm sure that we will learn a lot more in the next couple of years when the projects are actually started to be implemented. But for now, I think I see a lot of progress from the time that we started in February and where we are right now. So hopefully it will work out, but we should be flexible and change as needed and be vigilant and aware of what can go wrong. And we are thinking about having some measures in place, like hiring a consultant on the ground on behalf of the state to make sure that we are fully aware of how the funds are spent and potential issues that may arise down the road, to be able to respond to them quickly before things go wrong.
Thank you. Deborah.
Thank you. So on the Watts project, for instance, are you working with the applicants on some of the changes? For instance, going from 300 homes with solar to 60 seemed like a big drop to me. So are we? Is staff working with the applicants on some of the changes to make sure that they get down to the dollar amount that we want them to? Or
we do. On that particular one, there was some issue related to the cool roofs that during the round one we encountered, and that's one of the reasons that this particular project has changed. We didn't fund the cool roofs in the round one, and they were under a different assumption when they submitted their budget. That's the reason that project has gone down from 300 to 60. But we have been working closely with HACLA on how the projects are changing and why the budgets are changing, and making sure that the numbers matches, and we have enough information to backup information from the HACLA and the project scopes.
And then on the Fresno, so many changes on that one. I'm just wondering now, and I don't even know if this is really a question that needs an answer, but would this project, as it is looking right now, have been competitive against some of the other projects that didn't get our funding last time around? And maybe these changes just look more dramatic, because we're seeing them all right now, but it just seems like
there were 4 applications for 3.
Right.
And it was.
I know, but Pacoima was pretty close, right? I'm just wondering,
the council at the outset said that Fresno would receive funding.
Okay.
So it was a given, and the other 3 were competing for 2 slots. So it would not have changed, obviously. And I will note that the change in city administration has had an impact.
Well, maybe I'm need to go back and read our guidelines, but there were some changes that you said will have to come back to the SGC. There are some changes that seem to have been made. How do you make a determination on which changes need to come back to the SGC and which changes are just being negotiated by staff? Or maybe I'm missing something here.
I think I'm not getting the question. So
I think the question is the requirements that we noted are coming back to SGC. So on some of the conditional requirements of the grant, so that would be some of the transformative requirements, the workforce development, anti-displacement plan. Those, in order to get the grant agreement in place, we made those a deliverable of the first quarter of the grant, and there would be a step in which there would be an affirmative approval of what is brought back to SGC, because those were conditions that the council, as I understand, put on the grant.
Okay.
Initially with the award. And then the others were around tweaks, again, just shifting in the budget. And I will let Saharna speak to this, but there was definitely an eye towards if making sure, if those changes had become large, like we had changed a project type or something like that, that would have changed the scope of the overall project, we would have come back. But mostly but all of those changes were just within a given project type and, changing the scope or scale to adjust the budget accordingly. And those were made with this staff.
So during the pre-contract consultation, we had some policies like what we can really do during the pre-contract consultation. We looked into the projects. We said that you can propose a new project. You can shift, if there's any ineligible funds in the projects, you can shift that to other projects if needed, but you can't shift the eligible costs to other projects. So there were like some parameters around it that we felt that it's in our guidelines and like it's not too much of a deviation from what council approved. Like the conditions that we put in the project, like the fire tower, things like that, like basically we are not giving you the money unless you remove this. So, and some projects, they were straight out, they were eliminated. So that's where we are right now. And with the transformative ones, we want to make sure that they involve the community when they're developing it. So it's really truly reflective of the community process. And we'll bring that back to make sure that the council is approving those transformative requirements.
Yeah, I mean, I understand one of the issues with SGC is we have limited staff and limited staff time, but it would help me and I'm sure future councils to know, okay, because I'm looking, I'm not seeing, do we have a written presentation on this particular one? So it would help to have a written presentation that said, here's what the grant provides, or here's what the guidelines provide, here are some changes within those guidelines, here are some changes that are not within those guidelines, so they'll have to come back to you.
Okay, Matt, let me, I'll fall on my sword on this. I thought it would be useful to have this on this meeting. They had 1 month to prepare, and I felt like it was worth telling the council where we were. But they've been working very hard and did not have time to put materials together. So I will take responsibility for the lack of a packet.
So I will not twist the sword then that you've fallen on. But I will say that it would be helpful to have that sort of, because, when and then on some of these, well, they took out the high-speed rail connectivity. Well, hold it, that's fairly significant. Is that really the call of Fresno? Is that something that we should be having some say over? I also have some concern, as was pointed out by Councilmember Hoffman. Pacoima and Watts Rising were almost equivalent scores. If there are changes in Watts Rising that somehow makes that a less desirable project, then I would like to know that, because while I'm not saying that we would want to take the money from the Watts Rising, I realize a lot of work, but it's helpful for me to know and for the council to know, well, hold it, how significant are these changes? Would they have changed our decision on which project should be getting the grant in the first place? So having more information on issues like that would be helpful for us in the future. And we need to think about how much discretion, not that I don't trust the staff, but how much discretion we want to provide to make some changes that may significantly change the projects or change them enough that we might want to reconsider.
So 2 points on that. Number one was our, I suppose, error in requesting that the applications be for 35 million as opposed to 33 million. We should have not done that. So that would affect any applicant. And so I'm sure that's now changed. And then I'd probably mercifully forgotten my second point, so we'll just move on.
I understand that the issue seems to have been that we were requiring these changes, but it still does go to this. As I said, it was like recounts in the election. I mean, it's just how close is this, and would it have changed the balance?
My second point is that there is written into the guidelines some specific ability for the staff to rejigger, and what that means is probably open to both staff and council interpretation. So we'll obviously have the staff take a look at that.
So it's council interpretation that should make the difference, right?
Well, it depends. Anyway.
Sorry. So on the high-speed rail connectivity, that was a $7 million, I believe, change in the project. And I think a very important part of what this administration is trying to do. So is that a done deal, or is that something we can revisit? Because when I heard that,
there were two parts to that project. One part was in the north part, and the other one south part. And south part was much more important than the north one because this would connect the whole investment that we are making to the high-speed rail. And this was another important improvement in the downtown area. So from the logical perspective, the south one is the one that we really want to have. So if we want to weight one of them, I would also say that should have been in place. But if this is a project to be eliminated, we didn't make that decision. It came from the city of Fresno, and it's up to council to.
Yeah, I guess I wish that we had more input on some of these big changes, I guess.
Well, I think you're hearing the sentiment of the council that there probably needs to be more. Well, clearly there needs to be more information, and as I say, that was in part due to the fact that we've crammed in 3 council meetings in the last 3 months. But
we're not done cramming.
Yeah. Yes.
One statement I'll just make. One is we've also had a tremendous amount of staff change since January. So I want to acknowledge, first of all, the amount of work Saharnaz, Suzanne stepped in while we had staff on leave, the Department of Conservation team, and the whole TCC team. I mean, you saw how many meetings there were. So I want to point that out. I think the challenge was also we're essentially kind of building the plane while we fly. So I do think the fact that we have a template grant agreement that we now have with our round 1 awardees and something to work from is really important because it will ground the process going forward for round 2. Whereas, literally with the awards, we had no grant agreement. We didn't have a model for how to put together all these project types. And so, there wasn't sort of this common document that we were working from. And so I don't know, that's not going to answer all of these concerns. And I think we would love to hear how we can be better coming back to the council should changes be made. But I think the budget issue has been addressed in this NOFA. The budget amount is correct. It reflects the need for state admin. We've also reflected the need for the grantees to budget for certain activities that I don't think were accounted for, such as evaluation. So I do think there's a lot of steps that we have addressed in this round, but would certainly appreciate if there are ways that we can be coming back at a regular checkpoint or something like that should changes be made. I think we're absolutely open to that, but I do want to just acknowledge, I think we're at a place for round 2 that is much stronger and has a much more of a framework to work within than we did in round 1. So that I just would.
And you may want to think about proposing some options to the council. For example, we probably don't need enough to give you input on specific changes. You have to have some flexibility. On the other hand, and I can say this since I won't be here, that you might want to give the chair, maybe in consultation with the vice chair, some authority so that you get at least some input.
Okay.
That maybe think about some ways, because I think all of us probably have the same reaction on the $7 million on an element that was part of the statute or at
Right.
least of the regs.
Yeah, and that's certainly something we can think about and come back in December as we're looking at round 2 with some ideas for how we can carry that, have that be more of a partnership as we work on the implementation of round 2.
What happens? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, it sounds like Fresno's more of the exception rather than the rule, but it would help, I guess, to have some standards in terms of, what's the decision at the staff level that they can make us, and, what sort of rises to the level that needs to come back to the council. Just from a transportation perspective, that $7 million, that's a pretty substantial change that, no matter how you slice and dice it, it does, I think, impact sort of the utility, of that project. And so, it sounds like you guys are going through lots of lessons learned and, incorporating that, as you sort of go along. But it would sort of, maybe the checkpoints is a good start. But, where do you sort of draw that line to say, no, this isn't going to work? And how do you sort of, make some of those decisions moving forward? So,
I mean, I do worry a little bit that are we not setting a bit of a precedent in terms of new applications to pad them in a way? If we're seen as getting into a negotiation post-award where things get removed, so we've got to consider that. What happens to the $7 million?
That's the 5% admin cost for the state.
I'm sorry?
Of the
$7 million.
Their original proposal was 73, and the amount available was 66. So that is just money that was not available.
Not awarded.
Not awarded.
It really wasn't available for award. So the NOFA did not reflect the 5% admin that the state needs to run the program. So all of the budget requests from all 3 applicants came in at a higher amount, and then Fresno came in actually even higher. So where it said 70 million, 35, 35, we really should have been lower than that anyway to reflect that admin cost. And Fresno, in addition, came in at 73. So they really had about $7 million.
So a lot of these cuts had to be made.
They had to be made
anyway, unless they could accomplish other funding somewhere.
Exactly.
Which just sounds like none of them did.
Right.
None of them got additional funding.
Yeah, not in the time. They all had a leverage component, but in the timeline of working on this, they didn't come up with additional new funds to cover that necessary budget reduction.
I mean, I guess I'm most concerned by the last comment here under future considerations, where, you're basically saying that these projects may end up without the kind of transformation that we had hoped, and that they may be more of a collection of disparate parts. And that's, I don't think that was ever part of the intent here. And I think what you're hearing from council members is, at what point do we just say, no, this is, we got to go back to the drawing board with a ton of work?
So let me just say, look, remember, folks, this was the first year, and we took on $140 million, well, minus 5%, in 3 locations. And so I think, I've been following this reasonably closely since they're located in I'm located in their space. And so I think we've learned a ton. And if you remember the Affordable Housing Sustainable Communities program has gone through a lot of changes as we've learned things. And I think that 2 of the 3 have gone surprisingly well and smoothly. And the third we always knew would be a challenge, and it's probably been somewhat more of a challenge. So it's growing pains, and I want to acknowledge how hard people have worked. And just to point out that every time there's an issue in Fresno, people have to go down and meet face to face and talk it through, and then there'll be multiple views among the different participants in Fresno to try to negotiate. So this has been a very intensive process. And there have been a couple of times where they asked maybe I should go down, and then staff was able to resolve it without me, which apparently they don't want me anywhere near there, which is great. I've used up my. So I do really want to say, we probably should have presented this in a somewhat different form and not, maybe given a little more time to work it through and give everybody a packet. But I do really want to say it's being worked through, and as we learn more how to do it, it's going to be applied in the coming year and hopefully in the future.
And just really quick, I don't want the staff to walk away thinking that we're disappointed in your work, because I know you're all working really hard, and I know that Fresno is its own little creature, and there's been a lot of changes there. So it's just, I think we're all just very passionate about what this money is supposed to do. And
and the last part didn't concern me at all. I had the opportunity to tour both the Ontario and Watts sites, both before and after the award. It was very exciting. After the award, they're very happy people. I have no concern on the transformative part. Just the comment that I heard most often was just the process of applying alone was transformative, and which as birth is or anything, right? But truly remarkable in that it brought folks together that had never worked together and coordinated that had never worked before. So I don't have a concern, at least on those 2 areas. And also had a lot of, I'm not trying to pitch for Pacoima either, but I had an opportunity to see there, and transformation's already occurring there just by bringing folks together that are applying for these grants. So, Fresno's another story, but and I just haven't experienced them firsthand is the only difference.
I think it's working there too, but it's harder.
Yeah, and I would say that last bullet is not to say that's where we feel like we are. I think it's just the continual challenge of doing this kind of integrated work is how do we ensure that integration and connection is happening. And it's not just amongst the projects, it's also with the people. And I think that's the other piece of this is ultimately what we're trying to do is build that transformation from the ground up. So while we're going and meeting, we're also wanting to build that capacity and that collaborative structure there on the ground. So it's a little bit of, we're not making decisions for them. They're making decisions with that structure that is in place. And so, I think it's a new way for us to be doing work, and I think really this is just a reflection of the challenge of doing that. And it's going to be hard, but I think we are making a lot of progress, and there are just pieces that, I think figuring out how to best engage you all in doing it along the way, and all of that is, important for us all to figure out and learn as we go forward.
Yeah, just to summarize, because we've had a lot of discussions, it seems to me that the takeaways are, I agree. This was our first time out the chute, so we're learning an awful lot from this. For example, we're learning we need to deduct administrative costs from these grants. We will want to sort of set out very clearly what sorts of changes could be made by staff, what needs to come back to the council. And in doing that, one of the things then you have to think about is, okay, building into the process the fact that you may negotiate changes and want to bring those changes, proposed and recommended changes, back to the council at some future date. So you start building that into the timeline. We also need to be mindful of this sort of, I'll just call it a bait and switch, where the project is designed to get a lot of points, but then when there are changes or negotiations, somehow you lose some of those benefits that got the approval in the first place. What would be our standard for saying, no, hold it, these are the changes we can live with, these are the changes that we can't, so how are we going to do that? And then a big part of that, and I will just say that it's a, you know, I've made a couple of comments on how I've appreciated the work from staff, but as I think about it, one of the transformational changes here has been that when the SGC started out, it was all right not to have any large staff. It had a sort of a discrete, finite funding program that we were implementing. Now we're looking at potentially a much larger program through AHSC, through SALC, through TCC. We do need to take a look at what sort of staffing do we need in order to implement what has developed over the last 7 years into a very, very significant funding program where it wasn't before. So that's something that we all can carry forward as we're talking to the next administration, and should be a message I think that we need to think about carrying forward to the next administration, because I think these are all worthwhile programs. It's just been a fundamental change in the Strategic Growth Council.
And I have some pain having tried to help Randall and Louise get some more staff that has not always been approved. What else is new? Okay. All right. Have we slogged this sufficiently?
Thank you.
All right. I appreciate Matt's summary. I think all points well taken. So, thank you. Don't take it wrong. Take it as deep interest.
Get feedback. We really appreciate the feedback from council. It helps us to improve the program. That's the end goal of it. Thank you.
All right. Okay. Item 8 is GARE, or Government Alliance on Racial Equality. Julia.
Good afternoon. So I'm going to give a quick update on the Governing for Racial Equity Capital Cohort. And then one of our colleagues, actually from the Air Resources Board, who's part of the EPA team, is just going to speak very briefly about their experience with it. And then I'm going to turn things over to Suzanne, and she's going to talk specifically about the Strategic Growth Council's team and the work that's happening here at SGC. But I wanted to start with kind of the broad overview, and I'm going to keep this as brief as possible because I know that it's already been a long day, and I want to make sure that the other folks really get a chance to share what they want to bring to you. So in your packets, you have a couple of staff reports on the racial equity work, and the first one is from the Health and All Policies team about the GARE, Government Alliance on Race and Equity Capital Cohort, and that includes in your packet details about what this work is going to look like in 2019. And that's also available online. Part of what we try to do is, in terms of accountability, is make our work as public and accessible as possible. And I wanted to give a reminder that Health and All Policies has been around since 2010. It's really blossomed and grown under this administration and under this council. We're about really changing the culture of government and bringing health, equity, and environmental sustainability together across all of government. And we've come a long way, all of us, over the last 8 years in all of those regards. And it's been really tremendous. I've had a tremendous experience getting to be kind of on the convening side of that and working alongside all of you and your departments and agencies as you've really taken action. And then the racial equity work is new for us and really started this year in 2018, although equity has been a core component of our work throughout, and the racial equity part really grew out of that. And I want to thank all of you for your leadership and the ways that many of you have championed this work as we've done it. The point of this slide in front of you is just I pulled out some key phrases from SGC's vision statement, mission, and objectives, just to highlight that SGC is about promoting public health, promoting equitable communities, resilient communities, and coordinating the activities of state agencies and partners. So sometimes people ask me why this racial equity work is happening here with health and health policies and under the SGC, and I think this kind of ties it together. And we also know that racial inequities are one of the key drivers of health inequities. And that's something that we've explored quite a bit through our partnership with the Office of Health Equity at the Department of Public Health as well. And the Health and All Policies Task Force brought an action plan to this council in January around advancing equity through government practices. And we're doing that in a wide variety of ways with all of you, including through grant making. But one of our objectives specifically was to focus on racial equity and to work with departments to develop racial equity action plans. And so our GARE work is fulfilling that piece of our action plan. The image in front of you really kind of conveys that there's been a long history of institutional oppression in our country, in our state. We're trying to undo hundreds of years of oppressive policies, and we've come a long way in terms of removing explicitly discriminatory policies, and we haven't done enough, and there's still a lot of bias and a lot of practices that, whether they're intentional or unintentional, either cause harm or benefit some groups more than they benefit others. And so governing for racial equity comes in, and we now have a wide range of governments, including our own, that are working to support proactive policies, practices, and procedures that advance a wide range of equity issues, including racial equity. So the Government Alliance on Race and Equity is a national network of governments that are doing this work. They started in 2015, and they're run by the nonprofit organization Race Forward. And that network represents 35 states and more than 150 cities. But what I will say is about the 35 states, we're the only state that's doing this at the state government level at this point. So these cities, this work is really happening primarily in local jurisdictions. And I'll show you this next slide about California. California really is leading the way. And of the 150 jurisdictions across the country, a large number of them are in California. And I know this is pretty small, so it's hard to see, but we've got counties like Sonoma, Solano, Los Angeles. We've got cities like Oakland, Long Beach, the city of Arcata that are involved in this work with leadership from their mayors, their city councils, their boards of supervisors, and various departments. But we are the first state to have a state-level cohort, which we're really proud of and excited about, and other states are getting interested, and it looks like they may be following suit as well, which is really exciting. So we launched a cohort called the Capital Cohort in January, where we brought the GARE program to Sacramento. And at the time, we thought, well, we'll try this out and we'll see if we can get 3 or 4 departments to participate and go through a year-long learning process where they'll go through learning sessions, capacity building, get trained in a variety of tools, develop leadership teams, and develop racial equity action plans. So we did some recruitment, and it turned out that actually 18 departments and agencies said that they wanted to participate. We were really floored and thrilled, and some of those are on combined teams. So for example, SGC and OPR have a combined team, and then EPA has a team that's made up of 6 of the board's departments and offices. So we have 12 teams total, 15 people from each team, for a total of 170 very courageous, smart, and committed people participating in this year-long program. Each of these departments got sign-off from their highest level of executive, whether that was their department director or their agency secretary, to participate. And a few highlights of the year, as I mentioned, there were learning sessions. We did a lot of work on communication strategies, how to have conversations about race and racism within your institution, an organizational assessment tool that departments were able to use. And using all of that, they have been developing racial equity action plans. A couple of examples of ways that departments are using this. So Caltrans is talking about using these tools to bring an equity lens into their next strategic management plan. The Coastal Commission has used these tools in their update of their environmental justice plan. The Department of Education recently held a staff development day for 800 people, and they made racial equity their theme. And the Department of Public Health is doing a pretty intensive training, the trainers program around racial and health equity, where they're developing an in-house training team that can then help them branch out and train the many thousands of staff that they have. Some of the key areas of interest for the departments that have emerged over the course of the year are workforce development, language access, community engagement, environmental justice, and building the capacity of staff. And there's going to be more to come around this. This is kind of a teaser for where we're heading in 2019. So by popular demand, we're going to continue the program for another year. We don't know how long it will go, but we know we can go through at least 2019 because our foundation partners have been pleased enough with this work that they've agreed to provide additional support to carry it forward. So we will be working with the same departments in 2019 to help them finalize their action plans, implement actions, which is where we think the real work is going to take place, brief and engage new leadership. And then in addition, we think that, and we're already seeing this, that as departments are implementing actions, they're hitting against barriers and challenges, which is no surprise. If this work was easy, it would have been done a long time ago. And what we're finding is that multiple departments are hitting up against the same types of barriers. In all of the areas that I mentioned around workforce, budgets, and so on. And so part of what we'll be doing in the coming year is bringing leadership together from those teams to identify what those common barriers are and see what we can do to think about kind of systemic approaches so that departments aren't having to figure these things out one at a time. The departments are still enrolling and making their commitments. We're hoping for a 100% return. And they're working their way through approvals with their leadership right now, and the new cohort will start in January. And that's all that I wanted to share. I would like to invite very briefly Breen Afshan to come up and join me. She is with the Air Resources Board and is the community liaison for the Low Carbon Transport Division, and she's been an active participant and leader in the cohort this year, and I thought she could just share a few words about her experience.
Thank you very much, Julia. Good afternoon, Council. I'm Breen Afshan, California Air Resources Board. Thank you very much for the opportunity to comment and share my experience with GARE. First, I want to thank Health and All Policies Task Force team, especially Ms. Julia Kaplan, for providing us this amazing platform. The GARE training provided us the forum for coordination and collaboration. It gave us the opportunity to talk about racial equity issues collectively among Cal EPA and other state departments. As a community liaison, I work with issues to resolve issues with under-resourced communities. These communities face external inequities. GARE is an internally focused initiative that has provided us the opportunity to work on the internal facing issues that persist. External initiatives would greatly benefit from the internal inequities resolution. For us, GARE training formalized the inward-looking process and gave us the actual tools in the form of racial equity plan to evaluate and identify gaps and address issues. As a culmination of one-year-long work, our Cal EPA team is working on finalizing the plan of action for racial equity for our departments, which we are planning to implement next year. I strongly believe continuing those trainings conversations and vision is very, very important work. Staff across all sectors of government and the communities we serve will greatly benefit from it. Thank you very much. Thank you, Julia.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm happy to field questions or can turn things over to Suzanne, who's going to talk about the SGC team.
Let's go to Suzanne.
Great. Thank you. Hi, good afternoon. Suzanne Haig with SGC. I'm going to give you a little flavor of what this work has looked like at the department and agency level. Oh, sorry, I'll stop clicking. Over your clicking, and give you an update on SGC's work as a participant in this capital cohort in the GARE program. And I'll start maybe while you're pulling up the slides by just acknowledging the folks in the room. It's that one, you got it. Who are members of the team. We have 10 staff within SGC and OPR representing our program staff, policy staff, contracts, communications, personnel, and HR management who have committed to participating in this program across the span of 12 months in their extra time in addition to their normally mandated jobs. Can everyone in the room who is a member of the team just stand up for a minute and be recognized? And a lot of the folks on our team are actually not here today because they're on TCC site visits, but I wanted to acknowledge the ones who are. Thank you. So perhaps a bit repetitive of what Julia said, but just to drive home this notion of racial equity as being achieved when race can no longer be used to predict life outcomes, and outcomes are improved for everyone. And as Julia mentioned, unfortunately, we still have a lot of instances within California and within, throughout the country where race is a predictor of several life outcomes. So I won't go into too much detail in the data here, but we can see poverty rate disaggregated by race shows some pretty stark disparities, as does home ownership rate. These are all data from California specifically. Income left after housing costs for renters or housing cost burden fairly significantly disaggregated by race. Low-income persons lacking access to food. And finally, life expectancy itself is starkly disparate by racial, according to racial lines. So these are data from within California and suggest that indeed we have some more work to do. The good news is that our opportunity as the Strategic Growth Council is that we are really uniquely positioned to advance equity across state government within California, in part because of our mandate as coordinating across state government, also our responsibilities to distribute funding and other resources to communities and make sure that those are done in a way that purposefully and proactively advances equity. Leading innovation by example, we have, I think, a really nice track record of this. Just one example is our leadership in the technical assistance realm within CCI programs, climate investment programs, and how that has been sort of coordinated across agencies and disseminated through other aspects of state government. We're also relatively small and nimble compared to many of our sister agencies and departments, and that has allowed us to innovate and turn on a dime, perhaps more so than some of the agencies that are larger and have more bureaucratic red tape. No offense to anybody on the dais, of course, but it is an advantage that we have identified time and again. And finally, our committed leadership really allows us to take initiative in this area. So our process, as I mentioned, we have a team of 10 staff working over the course of 12 months, attending several training events and countless hours of internally focused meetings. Our process has centered on something that the GARE program calls the racial equity tool, which is really described in this diagram here, basically starting by looking at what are the desired results of what we do as an organization, and then a process of analyzing in a very deliberate way, are we in fact achieving those desired results? So just a quick for instance, in the area of contracting. We're an agency that increasingly does a lot of contracting to outside entities to perform services and sort of other procurement methods for us. In the area of technical assistance in particular, we rely on contractors to provide technical assistance to current and potential future CCI grantees throughout the state. The desired results there clearly to deliver effective technical assistance. And we know now through our experience that part of what effective technical assistance entails is having technical assistance providers that represent and reflect the communities that are intended to be served. But when we looked at the analysis of data, both the statistical data as well as the input from our stakeholders and community members, we found that in fact that was not always the case, that technical assistance contractors were representing and reflecting the communities that they were serving. And so just one early outcome of this work is that we're now looking at our technical assistance contracts to pilot an approach where we require all of the contractors to have a partnership with a local community-based organization or other local entity to begin to open up those opportunities for contractors that, that previously were not able to compete for those contracts. This is not clearly meant to be legible at that level, but is really just to visually describe part of our process. So that racial equity tool process, we took through all facets of the organization, from how we communicate with our external stakeholders and partners, to how we do hiring and promotion, to how we effectuate the programs and other statutory responsibilities that we have. And this is generally kind of categorized, it's sort of like a self-graded exam from worst to best, going from left to right. And you can see that we fall in the middle in most instances, and somewhat maybe skewed slightly to the left. So positive things that we have found through this analysis, first of all, we're proud that within SGC we have HIAP leading the entire state government in forming the GARE capital cohort. We also have within our programs an explicit aim to advance equity, and that's certainly a great and important jumping off point for this work. We have community engagement as a cornerstone of much of what we do. We genuinely value diversity among our staff, not just for diversity's sake, but also because we recognize that staff diversity helps us to implement the programs that we're charged with implementing, especially our focus on disadvantaged communities, and that we have leadership and staff commitment to equity, and that, again, is something not to be taken for granted. On areas to improve, we've found that there are several unintended structural barriers that we've been able to identify. So two quick examples of this. One is in talking about our pipeline for career development and bringing on new staff, and particularly young people, to learn about what we do within state government and in this work around strategic growth. We duly noted that we do not have the ability to pay interns to come to our office. So we have a crop of amazing interns that come through every summer, but obviously that's a barrier to students who come from a disadvantaged background. Another example of the structural barriers, we have within all of our grant programs a reimbursement basis built in as sort of a fundamental mechanism of state grant funding, and we have heard from several of our stakeholders that that really prevents competitiveness and prevents participation from some smaller organizations who can't afford to front money and then be reimbursed on a quarterly or other regular basis. Another area for improvement has been lack of data-driven accountability mechanisms. What this means is that basically we have very good intentions in many cases, but we don't always have the ability or the sort of pattern or history to collect the data and analyze them and keep ourselves accountable. Fewer resources to monitor outcomes, in particular in our personnel area. You know, it's noted that larger organizations have whole staff devoted to diversity and equal opportunity employment and tracking and monitoring the data on diversity within staff. And we have one noble and wonderful person in our office who does it all, but obviously many fewer resources to sort of look at that area of our work and to do better. And then finally, that our current commitment is largely personality-based and not necessarily codified. So we're looking at a lot of ways to institutionalize this work so that in 10 or 20 years, this is still the way that the SGC does business as usual. We've been able to implement several actions throughout the process, not waiting for an official plan to be adopted. Some of those include tweaking our program guidelines, for instance, encouraging more homeownership projects within the AHSC program, and sort of tightening our requirements around anti-displacement and community engagement in our grant programs. Within contracts, again, piloting this subcontract mechanism for local community-based organizations. And then on the career pipeline front, we have successfully engaged with a local high school and have now a high school intern in our office, as well as started advertising and doing outreach on our job openings beyond Cal Careers to some other places where we may get a different audience. I'll give you a taste of some of the draft recommendations that we've been discussing. Again, there's no sort of written plan as of yet, but just again, a flavor of what the team has been talking about in terms of some concrete actions that we could recommend to the council in the future. And these are categorized into 3 buckets of recommendations. The first being in this area of interagency collaboration, really leveraging the fact that SGC is the center of interagency coordination for much of this work across the state. And identifying ways for the council itself to lead, to facilitate, and to participate in more cross-agency learning around racial equity, peer-to-peer exchange, and sharing agency resources. Including trainings and research capacity. So again, kind of recognizing that we are small and therefore nimble, but also that we are small and therefore under-resourced, and that many agencies have, for instance, a staff training budget and regular staff trainings that come through the office all the time, and can we partner with them so that our staff can participate in those? The second area of draft recommendations focuses on our programs and our technical assistance. One of the recommendations involves developing partnerships to expand the diversity of our technical assistance contractors, piloting the advance payments for grants, which our Climate Collaborative's legislation 1072 now gives us the opportunity to do over that traditional reimbursement basis. And recruiting other GARE participants from other agencies to sit on our interagency review panels for our grant programs. And finally, in the area of organizational operations, on the human resources front, identifying some partners to potentially fund paid internships within our office, offering or even requiring racial equity training for staff, which is something that a lot of the other GARE participants throughout the country have ended up adopting as an outcome of their work. And seeking staff who represent the communities that we serve. So really thinking about the job descriptions that we put out, the work that we are intending to do in communities, and formulating job descriptions to make sure that we're bringing on staff who can best meet our mission of serving disadvantaged communities and who really represent those communities themselves. And in the contracting front, we're looking at how we track and report on contractor diversity. Our contracts staff actually discovered that there's a DGS form that is basically almost never used, but it actually exists, where you ask your contractors for some basic demographic information, and we're working with DGS to figure out, well, where did this form come from, and how do we better make use of the fact that it already exists to start to track and monitor some information, not just within SGC, but also potentially across other agencies, since this is a statewide mechanism. Developing partnerships to expand our contractor pool, so kind of developing a database of likely community-based and businesses that are owned by people of color and people in the communities that we intend to serve, and kind of keeping that on hand as a reference for bringing on additional contractors. And finally, developing a contracting desk manual. We are kind of having this growing pain moment of realizing that we need to develop some standard operating procedures for how we do things like contracting, and as a result has to develop a manual for staff, and it's a great opportunity to, again, institutionalize some of these practices that are kind of happening already because of the momentum that has been built within the GARE team, but we want to make sure that they're just standard practice going forward into the future. So our next steps, we aim to present a draft action plan to the council in the first quarter of 2019 for discussion and comment. And we've also discussed presenting to council an updated SGC vision statement that could reflect our commitment to equity. By mid-2018, presenting a final final racial equity action plan for council to consider for adoption. And then as part of that plan, having ongoing updates to council, including a periodic sort of built-in mechanism for assessing based on the data where we are we achieving our goals, and do we need to revise our action plan accordingly? And I'll stop there, and happy to take any questions. Thanks so much.
Okay. Questions or comments? Well, sorry to have you at the end of a long meeting, but thank you for the presentation and for all of the work on this. And I'm sure the next iteration of the council will appreciate the chance to look at the planning document and bring it forward.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you. And Katrina, you've been waiting very patiently, so now this is your item.
Good afternoon, council members. My name is Katrina Deloso, and I'm representing Prevention Institute. We're a national nonprofit based in Oakland, and we're dedicated to building prevention and health equity into key policies and practices at the federal, state, local, and organizational level. We work to ensure that places where all people live, work, play, and learn foster health, safety, and well-being. We're so pleased to be here today and to express our strong support for the state's continued involvement in the Government Alliance for Race and Equity, including its 2019 implementation of agency racial equity action plans. As an organization focused on health equity, Prevention Institute sees racial justice as inextricably linked to our mission. As Suzanne pointed out, even after controlling for socioeconomic status, there remains a striking pattern of health disparities among racial and ethnic groups, including African Americans, Latinos, Native Americans, and Asian Americans. And this occurs not only in the US, but here in California. These disparities are not coincidental or accidental, nor are they about poor choices, genetic makeup, or access to quality health care. They're produced by current and historical, racially driven policies, procedures, and practices that impact entire communities. As California's body to further sustainability and build equitable and resilient communities, it's especially valuable that the Strategic Growth Council champions the work of reversing these racial inequities. The Council's experience collaborating across agencies makes it uniquely positioned to coordinate and break down silos between the agencies participating in the GARE Capital cohort, supporting their efforts to align policies and practices to advance racial justice. Finally, participating in the cohort is valuable for the Council itself, supporting its mission of reaching out and working with disadvantaged communities, many of which have experienced individual and community-level trauma. Through the GARE cohort, the Council can deepen its understanding of how racism impacts these communities and further its learning on how to design trauma-informed grants and programs that acknowledge and address this. Excuse me. On behalf of Prevention Institute, thank you again for the opportunity to provide comment. We're looking forward to continuing to work with and support the important efforts of the Strategic Growth Council and the Health and All Policies Task Force. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, Harvey, you've been waiting patiently. You can have the, you can have the, oh, wait. You have, oh, I didn't see that. Sorry about that. Come on up. Well, Harvey, you'll get the last word, so you can, you can speak.
Good afternoon. My name is Angelina Rahimi. I am Community Development Director of Franklin Neighborhood Corporation. My colleagues, Nathan Olsch and Brian Bishop, and myself, we are working on TCC planning grant for the Franklin neighborhood in Sacramento. Before I talk about our community and the importance of racial equity, I would like to read a quote from Glenn Harris, President of the Center of Social Inclusion. Racial equity is about applying justice and a little bit of common sense to a system that's been out of balance. When a system is out of balance, people of color feel the impacts most acutely. But to be clear, an imbalanced system makes all of us pay. Our community, Franklin neighborhood, is racially diverse. About 50% have Hispanic origins, and 10% are black, and only 35% are white. We have received a TCC planning grant, and we are in process of community engagement. We realize that about 25% of our population don't speak English well. And there are at least 3 other common languages in our district. So we decided to hire 100 students from local high schools to go and interview their community members, who would be their parents and family members and friends, and speak their own languages. So when we talked about this with TCC staff, they supported our initiatives, and we were able to pay a small stipend to our students. They also shared other practices with us, such as having an advisory board with diverse racial background, which we are in a process to make it happen, especially before applying for the implementation grant. We believe it is very important for the state government to equip their staff with the knowledge and the resources to be able to pursue racial equity alongside locals and community organizations such as us. Without the understanding and support from the state agencies, we would not be able to fully engage racially diverse community members in our decision makings, and therefore we would not be able to address their needs and bring back equity and inclusion to our community. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Harvey, you're on.
Well, I kind of felt like I'm Harvey Etter. I'm speaking for myself and for the Public Solar Power Coalition. I kind of felt like I a little overdid it last time. But I do want to say some things. I've been involved with litigating against state agencies for not following what I think is the law. And this first happened in 91. Turn also did this. 81 with the first PUC decision on solar financing. The legislative intent in the late 70s and early 80s with the PUC was to study models of solar financing. What they did was they studied models of the investor-owned utility solar financing. So we brought up the issue of the equity issue of low, middle income subsidizing upper income through the rate base and the tax base, and also the antitrust issue. And this is still out there. And the investor-owned utilities and fossil fuels, whatnot, there's antitrust issues. And I'm a paralegal. I did 30 years ago out at UCLA. I'm not an attorney. I know a little about it. I've got to learn a lot more. Basically, working with PSPC and for myself. But litigated, that was before the Rose-Byrd court, and got Rose-Byrd's vote, and Tobriner didn't object. Could have had another bite at the apple. I didn't realize that had 30 days to come back. Anyway, it was shot down. On the low-income solar equity program, we said we were going to take the $18 million and 10% and administer it and put out RFPs, the community action agencies and everything, cities to put in to start these models. And this, when Santa Cruz, we had an energy conservation program, and I had the only solar position in it. Anyway, Sylvia Siegel came to us, and I talked with her, and she said the energy conservation programs with PG&E, they should be going down to the local programs like we had in Santa Cruz and or different places. And I was like the seed of public solar power, etc. Anyway, this was not dealt with then. To go on, have been dealing with the South Coast Air Quality Management Plan and CARB, South Coast for over 35 years, and CARB, when the Who Killed the Electric Car hearings were held, participated in that. Anyway, in the 79 and 82, 83, 84 plans for South Coast, they had solar. They had solar for hot water. They had solar for like boilers, 1161 and this type of thing. They never implemented it. That's the legal term, I believe, is backsliding with EPA. So this is still looking at it now. And anyway, so we said that challenge these plans in 91, the 91 plan in 92, and again with the 12 plan and the 16 plan. The relationship of natural gas is a big problem. I think I mentioned there's a section of the Health and Safety Code where the 53,002B that said it's a legislative intent not to have fossil fuels imported into California, and 90% imported. And this is not included in what's the blue paperback book, the air pollution laws of California. So that's a problem. Anyway, there's an emphasis now on a lot of talk. Jacobson and DeLucci 10 years ago when they published on converting to solar, wind, water, and solar in the November issue of Scientific American before the meeting in Copenhagen. We've got to also look at using solar thermal, which is basically being ignored, and there's a lot that's been done on this, and it's changing quick, and thermal energy storage, concentrating solar power and thermal energy storage. It lasts a lot longer. It's a fraction of the price, but it has to be centralized. Now, we can go into district power and heating and cooling systems. With the temperature going up and the fires and all this stuff, we've got to look at especially expanding cooling. The fourth assessment said we're looking at 3 to 5 degrees C by 2100. And then we've got the IPCC report, and we've got the federal report. They say we're in a tough situation unless we really get serious and act. We were talking about immediate total solar conversion to the district and whatnot 25 years ago, but I think it's got to be evaluated, and I can kind of go on, and well, sometimes I like to hear myself talk, but I
have
know
to
you
say
don't.
I agree with a lot of what you said in terms of district heating and cooling, and I think there's a lot for us to look at, and hopefully we'll continue moving in that direction, and thermal cooling as well. So thank you for being here all day. Much appreciated.
And on this concentrating solar and thermal energy storage, the folks the fellow that ran this program for DOE 40 years ago, they're still around. He's still around, and they wanted to try to have a meeting on this at the first of the year. So I just wanted to mention that, and I'm working with these folks.
I appreciate that, and I know that you know that Jerry Brown in his first administration was looking at a lot of this as well. So I'll say hi when we're done here. But thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
Okay, on that note, we are convened. Thanks a lot.